Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets comfortable, science wanders at a gentle pace, and the world outside your window softens just enough to let your thoughts drift without any need to hurry. I am really glad you found your way here tonight, or this morning, or whatever quiet corner of the day you happen to be sitting in right now. Before we ease into tonight's long, slow idea, take a moment to notice where you are. Are you listening from a bed with the lights low, a chair near a window, a couch that has seen better days, or maybe a train seat humming softly beneath you as the world slides past outside? And what time is it for you in this exact little slice of the planet? Funny how even asking that already pulls us into thinking about place, moment, and how many different versions of now are happening at the same time. If this space feels calming, if the slow walk through strange ideas and quiet science helps you unwind, you can always let the video know by giving it a like, or staying around by subscribing. It helps this small pocket of gentle curiosity find other people who might need a soft place to land at the end of their day. But for now, there is nothing you need to do at all. You can just settle in, let your shoulders drop a little, and allow your mind to wander somewhere far older, far wilder, and very different from the streets, screens, and schedules we usually move through. Tonight's thought begins with a simple twist to a very familiar story. We all grow up learning that the dinosaurs ruled the Earth for millions of years, and then, in a single dramatic chapter of the planet's history, they vanished. A rock from space, a sky full of fire, a world reshaped, and suddenly the age of giants ended, leaving small mammals to quietly inherit what was left behind. But imagine, just for a moment, that this part of the story never happened. Picture a world where the sky never filled with ash, where the sunlight never dimmed for years on end, and where the great reptiles of the past simply kept on living, growing, hunting, nesting, and wandering across the continents. Now let that idea sit there gently, like a stone dropped into still water. What kind of Earth would that be? Not a movie scene full of constant chaos and roaring battles, but a real breathing planet where enormous creatures and small, clever, upright walking mammals slowly learned how to exist in the same long stretch of time. Somewhere in that world, rivers would still wind their way to the sea, forests would still sway in the wind, mountains would still rise and crumble grain by grain, and woven into all of that, side by side, would be scales and skin, feathers and fabric, nests and villages, ancient instincts and curious hands reaching out to understand what lives nearby. It helps to begin by imagining the moment where our familiar history quietly splits in two. 66 million years ago, give or take a few wandering millennia, a massive asteroid is believed to have slammed into what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. The impact released energy beyond anything human technology has ever produced, triggering global fires, massive earthquakes, and a long, dark winter that choked off sunlight and collapsed ecosystems. In our world, that was the end of most large dinosaurs. In this other version of Earth, something shifts. Maybe the asteroid passes just wide of the planet. Maybe it breaks apart in the atmosphere, scattering harmlessly into glowing fragments. Maybe it hits the ocean at a shallow angle and loses most of its destructive power. The exact detail does not matter much. What matters is that the long night never comes. Without that global reset, life keeps moving forward along the paths it was already following. The giant herbivores continue to reshape forests and plains as they move in slow, steady herds, pulling down branches, flattening undergrowth, and leaving wide, open spaces behind them. Predators continue to stalk the edges of these living landscapes, their senses tuned to movement, sound, and scent. Birds, already descendants of small feathered dinosaurs, fill the skies with wings and calls, blurring the line between what we would later call modern and prehistoric. Meanwhile, the mammals of this world are still there too. Small, warm-blooded, mostly nocturnal, living in burrows, trees, and hidden corners. They scurry, climb, dig, and hide, doing what they have always done best, surviving in the spaces left behind by larger, louder, more dominant neighbours. In our familiar history, these mammals eventually stepped into a world suddenly emptied of giants. In this slower, quieter version of the story, they do not get that sudden opportunity. Instead, they evolve under pressure that never really lets up. Generation after generation, these small creatures learn how to read the world around them with incredible care. The ground is not just ground. It is a map of vibrations, telling them when something heavy is moving far away and when something dangerous is moving close. The air is not just air. It carries the scent of leaves, water and predators on the wind. The shadows are not just absence of light. They are places where you can hide, and also places where something else might be waiting. Over millions of years, those tiny changes add up. Hands become more flexible. Eyes become more forward-facing. Brains grow, not because intelligence is a grand goal, but because problem-solving is a very useful tool when you share your world with creatures that can step over your home without even noticing it was there. This is not a sudden rise to dominance. It is a long, careful climb shaped by caution, creativity, and a deep instinctive awareness that the world is much bigger than you are. As these early human ancestors slowly take shape, their environment is unlike anything we would recognize from our own distant past. Imagine standing on the edge of a wide plain at dawn. The light is soft, just beginning to warm the land. Mist hangs low over the grass. In the distance, you can hear deep, rhythmic sounds, not quite roars, not quite calls, but something in between. The ground vibrates faintly under your feet as a herd of massive, long-necked herbivores moves across the horizon, their silhouettes rising and falling like slow-moving hills. Closer by, smaller dinosaurs pick their way through the undergrowth, snapping at insects, rustling leaves, darting back into cover when they sense movement that does not belong. Above, shapes glide between trees and sky, wings catching the early light as feathered creatures circle and settle. And somewhere in the middle of all this, a small group of humans huddles near a riverbank, watching, listening, and learning. These people do not see the dinosaurs as monsters or movie villains. To them, these animals are simply part of the world, as natural as rain or wind or the changing of seasons. The largest ones are treated with a kind of distant respect, the way you might treat a mountain or a storm. You do not challenge them. You do not try to control them. You pay attention to where they move, when they drink, and how the land changes after they pass through. Over time, patterns emerge. The humans learn that certain paths are safer at certain times of day. They notice that predators follow the herds, and that the herds follow the water and the fresh growth of plants. They begin to plan their own movements around these slow, massive migrations, setting up camps where the land will be quieter for a while, then packing up before the giants return. Fire becomes one of their most important tools, not just for warmth or cooking, but for signalling and safety. A line of small flames along a hillside can guide a herd away from a valley where people are sleeping. Smoke can warn others of danger. Light in the darkness can keep curious eyes and teeth at a respectful distance. This is not a world where humans conquer nature. It is a world where they negotiate with it, moment by moment, choice by choice. Language, in this version of history, grows rich with references to scale, sound, and movement. Words for far and near become very precise. There are many ways to describe a footstep depending on how heavy it is, how fast it comes, and what direction it's moving. Stories passed around evening fires are not just entertainment. They are lessons, warnings, and maps of memory. A tale about a narrow escape from a river crossing becomes a guide for future travellers. A song about a clever trick played on a small, sharp-toothed hunter becomes a lesson in observation and patience. As generations pass, tools become more refined. Stone blades, wooden spears, and woven shelters appear, all designed with a careful eye toward both protection and flexibility. Homes are not built to last forever. They are built to be left behind when the land changes, when the herds return, or when the forest grows too thick or too thin. The idea of a permanent city takes a long time to feel safe in a world where something much larger than your strongest wall can wander by without any interest in what you have built. And yet, slowly, very slowly, those cities do begin to appear. They rise in places where natural barriers offer some measure of peace. High plateaus surrounded by steep cliffs, islands in wide rivers, valleys with narrow entrances that can be watched and guarded. These early settlements are not loud, sprawling centres of power. They are quiet clusters of homes, storage spaces and shared fires, arranged with careful attention to sightlines and escape routes. From above, if you could float like a bird and look down, you would see a patchwork world. Vast stretches of land still ruled by tooth, claw and scale, and tucked into the edges, corners and sheltered spaces, the growing marks of human presence, paths worn into the earth, fields carefully planted in areas less likely to be trampled, towers built not for glory, but for watching the horizon. The relationship between humans and dinosaurs in this world is complex and always changing. Some smaller species become familiar neighbours, tolerated and even welcome because they eat pests or warn of larger dangers. People learn the calls and behaviours of these animals the way we learn the sounds of birds in our own backyards. A sudden silence in the trees means something is coming. A certain pattern of movement in the grass means it is time to move, now, without argument. There are moments of conflict, of course. Crops are destroyed, livestock is taken, homes are crushed by creatures that never even notice what they have done. In response, humans develop clever, careful ways to guide and discourage rather than fight. Fences made of fire pits and smoke, fields planted with plants that large herbivores do not like to eat, noisemakers that turn with the wind, creating unpredictable sounds that make cautious animals choose another path. This constant dance with the larger world shapes human culture in deep ways. Strength is admired, but so is awareness. Bravery is respected, but so is the wisdom to step back and let something pass. The heroes of stories are not always the ones who fight the biggest beasts. Often, they are the ones who notice a subtle change in the wind, or remember an old story at just the right moment, or choose a different path that keeps everyone safe. As technology slowly advances, humans begin to study their giant neighbours more deliberately. Bones, feathers, shed scales, and abandoned nests are collected and examined. Early science grows out of simple questions. Why do some creatures grow so large? How do they breathe, eat, and move? What makes one dangerous and another gentle? Knowledge becomes another kind of tool, one that can be carried without weight, shared without fire, and passed down without wearing out. Time in this world feels different. Not rushed, not tightly scheduled. The presence of creatures that live long lives, move slowly, and change the land over decades rather than years, encourages a broader view. Plans are made not just for the next season but for the next generation. A grove of trees planted today might be intended to feed both humans and herbivores 50 years from now. A path cleared through the forest might be meant for grandchildren who have not yet been born. And through all of this, the human sense of wonder never really fades. Imagine a child standing at the edge of a field, watching a massive creature drink from a river. The child's entire world, every story they have ever heard, every fear and comfort they know, is wrapped up in that moment. The sound of water, the slow rise and fall of a giant chest, the feeling of being small but not insignificant. That feeling, carried forward through countless lives, becomes part of what it means to be human in this shared world. Not rulers of the planet, not helpless prey, but participants in a vast living system that began long before them and will continue long after. As the centuries roll on, humans grow more confident, more capable, and more curious. They begin to explore farther, build higher, and record their thoughts in marks, symbols, and eventually writing. Libraries appear alongside watchtowers. Schools rise near river crossings. Knowledge spreads not just about stars and seasons, but about the habits, migrations, and needs of the ancient creatures that still walk the land. The world does not become safe. It becomes understood, at least a little more than before. And in that understanding, a new kind of relationship begins to form. One that is less about simple survival and more about coexistence. Somewhere down the line, someone will start asking bigger questions. Not just, how do we live alongside them, but what do they need from us, and what do we need from them? The idea that humans might be stewards of a world that includes giants as well as themselves begins to take root. Laws are written, not just for people, but for the protection of nesting grounds, migration paths, and feeding areas. It is not perfect. There are arguments, mistakes, and moments of regret. There are times when progress pushes too hard, and the world pushes back. But the conversation never really stops. It keeps moving forward, shaped by every footprint in the mud, every shadow crossing a field, and every quiet moment spent watching something ancient and alive breathe in the fading light. And that is where this long, imagined path leaves us for now, standing at the edge of a world that feels both familiar and completely changed. A place where the hum of human life mixes with the deep, steady presence of creatures from a time we usually only meet in museums and books. A world still unfolding, still learning how to balance curiosity, caution, and care. So, as you sit or lie there, listening to this idea drift past like a slow-moving river, you can let your mind wander ahead a little. What would it feel like to wake up tomorrow in a place where the distant sound on the horizon might not be traffic or thunder, but the footsteps of something that has been walking the earth for longer than any story you have ever heard? Somewhere deep in the long memory of the planet, there is a moment that never happened. No blinding flash across the sky, no roar that split the horizon, no long winter of dust and shadow that turned noon into twilight for years on end. In this version of Earth's story, the sky stayed quiet. The stars kept their distance. The sun rose and set as it always had. And life, in all its sprawling, breathing, crawling, flying variety, simply kept going. It is strange to think about how much of our own world hangs on a single event that lasted only a few seconds. A rock from space moving faster than any storm, any arrow, any machine humans would one day build, struck the planet and changed everything. But tonight, let that moment soften and fade. Let it pass harmlessly by. Let the sky remain what it had been for millions of years before, a wide blue ceiling by day, a scattered field of light by night, watching quietly as Earth turned beneath it. On that ordinary, extraordinary day, somewhere in what would one day be a warm, shallow sea, waves rolled in and out with gentle persistence. Fish darted through coral and shadow. Above the water, long-winged creatures glided on rising air, their silhouettes crossing the sun. Far inland, forests stretched and shifted in the breeze, leaves whispering to one another in a language older than memory. And across plains and valleys, the great herds moved as they always had, guided by hunger, thirst, and the slow, deep rhythm of the seasons. Nothing fell from the sky to interrupt them. Without the impact, there was no sudden break in the chain of life, no mass extinction that cleared the stage for a new cast of characters. Instead, evolution continued its patient work, one generation at a time, shaped by climate, competition, chance, and the quiet mathematics of survival. The world remained crowded, complex, and full of ancient lineages that never had to make way for something entirely new. Climate still shifted, of course. Ice ages came and went, seas rose and fell, continents drifted, nudging oceans into new shapes and redirecting winds and currents. These changes reshaped habitats slowly, sometimes gently, sometimes harshly. Species adapted, migrated, or vanished in small numbers, the way they always had. but there was no single, dramatic curtain called for the giants of the land. The large dinosaurs, especially the great plant-eaters, continued to play a central role in shaping the Earth's surface. Their movements turned forests into open woodlands and grasslands into patchworks of trampled paths and fresh growth. When a herd passed through, it was like a moving storm, not of rain and wind, but of bodies and breath. Trees were pushed aside, shrubs were flattened, seeds were carried in stomachs and dropped miles away, tucked into rich natural fertilizer. Predators followed these changes closely. Where the herds went, opportunities followed. Not every hunt was a chase across open land. Often, it was a waiting game, a careful study of weak points, a slow narrowing of distance. Smaller predators learned to work the edges, picking off young or sick animals, while the largest hunters focused on moments when size and strength could overcome caution and numbers. Above all of this, birds, already well established as descendants of smaller feathered dinosaurs, diversified into an even wider array of shapes and habits. Some grew larger, filling niches that in our world would belong to mammals. Others became more specialized, hunting insects, fish, or even small reptiles. The sky remained a busy place, full of calls, shadows, and constant motion. And beneath this towering, flapping, stomping world, mammals continue to exist, adapt, and quietly change. Without a global extinction event to clear the way, mammals never had the sudden explosion of opportunity that shaped our own history. There were no empty continents waiting to be filled by warm-blooded creatures ready to grow large and bold. Instead, mammals remained mostly small, clever, and cautious, finding success in places where dinosaurs were less dominant. Underground, in trees, along rocky coastlines, in the deep, tangled undergrowth where size became a disadvantage rather than an advantage. This pressure shaped them in subtle but powerful ways. Claws became better for digging and climbing. Whiskers became more sensitive to air movement and touch. Ears became finely tuned to low rumbles and distant footsteps. Brains slowly grew, not in a dramatic leap, but in a steady accumulation of problem-solving ability, memory, and social awareness. It is easy to imagine that intelligence only thrives when there is room to dominate. But in this world, intelligence grows in the margins. It grows in the spaces where you have to notice patterns, remember safe paths, and understand the behavior of creatures much larger than yourself. It grows when cooperation becomes the difference between being noticed and being ignored, between being hunted and being hidden. Over time, some of these mammals begin to stand a little taller. Hands become more flexible, better at gripping branches, stones, and eventually tools. Eyes shift forward, improving depth perception. Social bonds become more complex because living in groups offers safety and shared knowledge in a world that can be unforgiving. Meanwhile, the dinosaurs themselves are not standing still in evolutionary terms. They too adapt and change. Feathers spread further among different groups, not just for warmth or display, but for improved movement, balance, and communication. Some species become more social, forming larger, more coordinated herds. Others grow more solitary, relying on stealth and territory rather than raw power. The result is a world that feels deeply layered. There is no single age that ends and another that begins. Instead, there is a long overlap, a weaving together of ancient and emerging forms of life, all adjusting to one another in a slow, ongoing conversation, written in footprints, nests, burrows, and bones. As the continents continue their quiet drift, new environments appear. Mountain ranges rise where oceans once lay, rivers carve deep valleys, deserts expand and shrink with changing climate patterns. Each shift creates new challenges and new opportunities. In colder regions, feathered dinosaurs thrive, their insulation allowing them to remain active where scaly reptiles struggle. In warmer, wetter areas, massive herbivores flourish, supported by dense plant growth and abundant water. Along coastlines, a mix of both reptiles and mammals learn to exploit the edge between land and sea, feeding on fish, shellfish, and stranded creatures left behind by the tides. Somewhere in these shifting landscapes, the earliest true humans begin to take shape, not as conquerors, not as rulers, but as careful observers and quiet participants in a world already full of powerful life. Their days are shaped by movement and listening. The sound of the ground matters. The pattern of bird calls matters. The smell of the wind matters. A sudden change in any of these can mean the difference between a calm afternoon and a dangerous encounter. They learn the routes of the great herds the way sailors learn the currents of the sea. They know when certain valleys will be busy and when they will be empty. They time their own movements to avoid being in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Camps are set up near water, but not directly on the paths used by the largest animals. Fires are built where the smoke will drift away from feeding grounds rather than toward them. These people do not see themselves as separate from the land. Their survival depends on understanding it as a whole system, where every large movement sends ripples through everything else. When a herd passes, plants grow back differently. When predators move in, smaller animals scatter. When the seasons change, everything shifts again. Stories become a way to hold this knowledge. Around quiet fires at night, elders describe places that were safe once and dangerous now. They talk about rivers that change their course after heavy rains, and plains that become crowded when the dry season comes. They describe the behavior of specific animals, not just in general terms, but as individuals and groups with habits and preferences. A particular large herbivore might be known for always stopping at a certain bend in the river. A certain predator might be recognized by a scar or a missing tooth. Its presence a warning that travels faster than it does. These details matter. They become part of the shared memory of the group. As humans slowly spread across the continents, they carry this way of seeing the world with them. Wherever they go, they adapt not just to the land, but to the creatures that already live there. Tools and shelters are shaped by what threatens them and what helps them. In some regions, elevated homes become common, built on platforms or in trees to stay above curious or dangerous animals. In others, people favour shallow caves or rocky overhangs that offer protection without cutting off escape routes. Farming, when it eventually appears, looks different in this world. Fields are smaller, more scattered, often hidden within natural clearings rather than laid out in wide, open stretches. Crops are chosen not just for what humans can eat, but for what larger animals will ignore. Plants with bitter leaves, strong smells, or tough fibres become valuable, not because they are pleasant, but because they are left alone. Over time, humans begin to experiment with guiding the movement of animals rather than simply avoiding them. They learn that certain plants can attract or repel. They discover that lines of smoke, noise, or even simple visual markers can influence the paths taken by herds. This is not control in the strict sense. It is more like suggestion, a gentle nudge in one direction rather than another. The idea of ownership over land develops slowly. It is hard to claim a place as yours when something large enough to reshape it can pass through at any time. Instead, people think in terms of seasons, routes, and shared spaces. This valley is quiet in winter. That riverbank is busy in spring. This high ground is safe during the migrations. As communities grow larger, trade begins to link distant groups. Feathers, bones, shells, and stones from far-off places become valuable, not just as tools, but as symbols of connection to the wider world. Stories travel with these objects, carrying news of lands where different kinds of giants walk, where the air smells different, where the ground feels different underfoot. And through all of this, the dinosaurs remain a constant presence, not frozen in some ancient form, but evolving alongside the humans who study them, avoid them, and occasionally admire them from a safe distance. Some species become smaller over time, finding success in agility rather than size. Others grow even larger, supported by changing plant life and open landscapes. The diversity of forms becomes staggering. Horned faces, crested heads, long tails, wide wings, thick armour, bright feathers, dull scales. The planet becomes a moving gallery of shapes and behaviours, each one a response to the pressures and opportunities of its environment. For humans, this constant exposure to variety and power shapes their thinking in deep ways. Their myths and beliefs do not centre on a single kind of animal or a single kind of force. Instead, they reflect a world where many kinds of strength exist: speed, size, stealth, cooperation, endurance, intelligence. The idea of balance becomes central, not as an abstract concept, but as a practical truth. If too many predators gather in one place, the herds move on. If the herds leave, the land changes. If the land changes, the people must move too. Everything is connected, not in a poetic sense, but in a very direct, cause and effect way that can be felt in empty fields and crowded rivers. As writing and record keeping develop, humans begin to document the long patterns of this shared world. They note how often certain migrations occur. They track changes in climate and vegetation. They describe new species and disappearing ones. These early records are not just scientific in nature, they are also deeply practical, serving as guides for future generations who will need to know where to go and when. At some point, the idea arises that the world itself has a history, not just people. That the land, the animals, and the sky are part of a long story that stretches back far beyond any memory. Fossils, already present in this world just as in our own, become objects of curiosity rather than mystery. People begin to understand that the creatures they live alongside today have ancestors buried in stone, traces of earlier versions of the same ongoing experiment. This realization does something quiet but powerful to the human sense of place. Life is no longer just about surviving the next season or raising the next generation. It becomes about belonging to a much longer chain of existence, one that includes both the living and the long gone. And still, through all of this slow unfolding, the sky remains what it was on that day when the great impact never came. It holds the sun, the moon, and the stars. It brings storms and clear nights. It watches migrations and settlements, births and extinctions, questions and discoveries. Occasionally a bright streak of light will still cross it, a small meteor burning up harmlessly in the upper air. People will point, make wishes, tell stories about what it means, but none of those lights will carry the weight of a world-ending event. They will remain what they are, brief reminders that the universe is wide and full of movement, even when it does not choose to interrupt. As human societies grow more complex, building cities that rise higher and spread farther, the presence of dinosaurs never quite fades into the background. Urban planning includes wide corridors left open for animal movement. Bridges and tunnels are designed with more than just human traffic in mind. Warning systems develop to alert communities when large herds or predators are approaching. Technology advances, but it does so with a different set of priorities. Strength is important, but awareness is more so. Speed matters, but so does predictability. Machines are built to move quietly, to signal their presence clearly, to avoid startling animals that could react with dangerous force. Science, too, grows with a unique focus. Biology becomes one of the most respected fields, not as an abstract pursuit, but as a necessary part of daily life. Understanding how these massive creatures breathe, reproduce and move helps people design safer structures, better warning systems, and more effective ways to share the land. And through all of this, there is a shared understanding, even if it is not always spoken aloud. The world did not change in a single dramatic moment. It changed slowly, continuously, shaped by countless small decisions, adaptations, and accidents. The day the sky stayed silent becomes, in hindsight, not a single day at all, but a long stretch of time in which life was allowed to keep experimenting with itself. No sudden reset, no clean break, just a deep, ongoing conversation between past and present, scale and skin, feather and hand. As you let this version of Earth settle in your mind, you might notice how different it feels from the stories we usually tell about our place in the world. There is no clear moment where we arrive and they leave. Instead, there is a long overlap, a shared stage where many forms of life continue to act out their roles at the same time. And somewhere ahead, in the quiet distance of this imagined timeline, new questions begin to take shape. What does it mean to build a future in a world that still belongs so strongly to its past? How do you grow, explore, and create without pushing aside what has been there for millions of years before you? Long after the day the sky stayed quiet and the world continued without interruption, the planet itself kept doing what it has always done best. It moved, slowly, steadily, and with a patience that makes even the longest human history feel like a passing thought. Continents that once fit together like pieces of a puzzle continued to drift apart, carried on deep currents of heat and stone beneath the surface. Oceans widened, mountain ranges rose where land collided, and valleys opened where the ground stretched and thinned. Through all of it, the giants of this world stayed with the planet, their lives unfolding alongside the slow reshaping of Earth itself. If you could somehow watch this version of the world from far above, not for a day or a year, but for millions of years at a time, you would see the land breathe. Forests would advance and retreat as climates warmed and cooled. Ice would creep down from the poles and then pull back again, leaving behind carved valleys and scattered stones. Rivers would change their minds, carving new paths through rock and soil, sometimes abandoning their old courses entirely. And across these shifting surfaces, herds would continue to move, generation after generation, their paths bending gently to match the new shapes of the land. The presence of such massive creatures had a subtle but lasting effect on how these changes played out. Where herds travelled regularly, forests struggled to reclaim the ground. Trees that grew too slowly or too softly were pushed aside, leaving room for tougher plants, grasses and shrubs that could survive being trampled or eaten. Over long stretches of time, this created wide corridors of open land, not unlike natural highways, winding across continents. These corridors became familiar routes not just for the giants, but for everything else that followed in their wake. Smaller animals learned that these paths meant easier travel, better visibility, and often more abundant food. Predators found that following the herds meant following opportunity. Birds discovered that the disturbed ground left behind by heavy feet exposed insects and seeds. Even plants adapted, evolving ways to take advantage of the churned soil and the nutrient-rich droppings left behind. Seeds with tough outer shells or sticky coatings found success by hitching rides on scaly skin or feathered flanks, travelling far beyond the reach of wind or water alone. Humans, emerging quietly into this world of movement and change, quickly learned to read these living maps. A well-worn path through a forest was not just a trail. It was a sign of regular traffic, a place where the land itself had been shaped by something larger and older. Settlements grew near the edges of these routes, close enough to benefit from the open space and resources, but far enough away to avoid being in the middle of a passing migration. As the continents drifted, climates shifted in ways that sometimes challenged both dinosaurs and humans alike. Regions that were once warm and wet became drier and cooler. Coastal plains flooded and then reappeared as sea levels rose and fell. In some areas, long periods of stability allowed ecosystems to become incredibly complex, with dozens of species filling every possible niche. In others, rapid changes forced life to adapt quickly or move on. Feathered dinosaurs thrived in cooler climates, spreading across regions where thick fur would later dominate in our own world. Their insulation and social behaviour allowed them to survive long, cold seasons, sometimes gathering in large groups for warmth and protection. In warmer zones, massive, slow-moving herbivores continued to shape the land, their size allowing them to reach food sources that smaller animals could not, and their sheer presence discouraging most threats. Predators adapted to these shifts as well. Some grew leaner and faster, built for long chases across open plains. Others became ambush specialists, blending into dense forests or rocky terrain, waiting patiently for the right moment to strike. The balance between hunter and hunted never settled into a simple pattern. It shifted with every change in vegetation, every new land bridge, every slow turn of the planet that altered the flow of wind and water. Humans, still small in number compared to the vast populations of animals around them, found themselves becoming students of these patterns. Their survival depended less on raw strength and more on timing, knowing when a valley would be quiet, knowing when a river would be crowded, knowing when the wind would carry their scent toward a feeding ground, and when it would carry it safely away. As glaciers advanced during colder periods, both humans and dinosaurs were pushed toward lower latitudes. Regions closer to the equator became crowded, full of life-seeking warmth and stable food sources. In these places, the interactions between species became even more complex. Competition for space and resources increased. Predators found more prey, but also more rivals. Herbivores found lush growth, but also more obstacles. Humans in these crowded zones developed more sophisticated ways of sharing space. Temporary shelters became common, designed to be set up and taken down quickly as conditions changed. Communication between groups grew more important, allowing people to pass along information about dangerous areas, shifting routes, and changing climates. As the ice retreated, new lands opened up. Forests grew where there had once been bare stone. Grasslands spread across plains that had been frozen for thousands of years. Life rushed in to fill these new spaces, and humans followed, carrying their knowledge and stories with them. Over long periods, the slow drift of continents brought distant lands closer together or pulled them apart. Land bridges formed and vanished. Oceans opened where forests once stood. These changes allowed species to mix in new ways. Dinosaurs that had evolved in isolation suddenly found themselves sharing territory with unfamiliar neighbours. Some adapted, some were outcompeted, some found new roles in reshaped ecosystems. Humans were part of these exchanges as well. They travelled along coastlines, crossed narrow straits, and eventually learned to build simple vessels that allowed them to move between islands and along shores. The presence of large marine reptiles in the seas added another layer of challenge and wonder to these journeys. Coastal communities learned to read the water as carefully as inland groups read the land, watching for signs of large shapes moving beneath the surface. The idea of the world as a connected whole began to take shape, not in abstract terms but in practical ones. A change in the climate of one region could alter migration patterns in another. A shift in ocean currents could affect the availability of fish along a distant shore. Everything, from the smallest plant to the largest creature, was part of a web that stretched across continents and oceans. As human societies became more settled and more organised, they began to leave lasting marks on the land. Fields were cleared, not in vast open swaths, but in carefully chosen pockets. Forests were managed rather than simply cut down, with certain trees left standing to provide shelter for animals and shade for crops. Water was guided into channels and reservoirs, creating stable sources of irrigation that did not interfere with major animal routes. In some regions, people learned to work with the natural movements of the giants rather than against them. Seasonal festivals grew around the arrival or departure of herds. Markets and gatherings were timed to coincide with periods of quiet land, when travel was safer and resources were more predictable. The rhythms of human life became, in many places, closely tied to the rhythms of much larger neighbours. This connection shaped art and expression as well. Cave paintings and carvings did not just depict animals as symbols or trophies, they showed them as part of daily life, moving through landscapes that also included people, rivers, and stars. Over time, these images became more detailed, reflecting a growing understanding of anatomy, behaviour, and environment. In places where writing developed, records were kept not just of kings and battles, but of droughts, floods, migrations, and unusual animal behaviour. A sudden change in the route of a major herd might be noted alongside the birth of a ruler. An especially harsh winter might be remembered for both the loss of crops and the loss of animals that failed to find food. Science in this world grew from close observation rather than distant experimentation. People studied bones, not as relics of a lost age, but as clues to living systems. They examined feathers, scales, and skin to understand how different creatures stayed warm, stayed cool, or stayed protected. This knowledge fed back into human design, influencing clothing, shelter, and even early machines. As technology slowly advanced, humans began to alter their environment in more noticeable ways. Roads appeared, not as straight lines cutting across the land, but as winding paths that avoided major animal corridors and dangerous terrain. Bridges were built high enough to allow large creatures to pass beneath. In some regions, tunnels were carved through rock, rather than risk blocking a well-used route. The idea of shared space became a guiding principle in many cultures, not always followed perfectly, not always agreed upon, but often present as an underlying value. Conflicts arose when growing cities pushed too close to migration paths or feeding grounds. Sometimes humans moved. Sometimes they tried to redirect the animals. The results were mixed, and the lessons learned were often passed down in stories that carried both pride and regret. As centuries passed, climates continued their slow cycles. Warm periods allowed forests to expand toward the poles. Cold periods pushed them back. Deserts grew and shrank. Sea levels rose and fell. Through it all, life adapted, migrated, or transformed. Some dinosaurs developed remarkable long-distance travel abilities, following seasonal changes across entire continents. Their movements became one of the most predictable large-scale patterns on the planet, a living pulse that could be felt in the rise and fall of local ecosystems. Humans learned to anticipate these pulses, planning harvests, construction, and travel around them. In other areas, isolated populations of dinosaurs evolved into forms found nowhere else. On islands, smaller, more agile species thrived. In enclosed valleys, larger, heavier animals dominated. This patchwork of life made the world feel vast and varied, even to those who travelled widely. For humans, exploration remained both tempting and risky. Every new land offered resources and opportunities, but also unfamiliar creatures and unknown patterns. Scouts and travellers became important figures in many societies, valued for their ability to read landscapes and return with useful information. As communication between distant regions improved, knowledge began to spread more quickly. Techniques for building safer shelters, guiding animals, and managing land were shared across cultures. A method developed in one valley might, over time, find its way to another continent. This slow exchange created a sense of a world that was not just large, but connected. People began to think in terms of regions rather than just villages, of continents rather than just valleys. The presence of the giants, visible in nearly every part of the world, reinforced this sense of shared experience. No matter how different the cultures or climates, the deep footprint of ancient life was a common thread. As human understanding of the planet grew, so did a sense of responsibility. Some cultures began to set aside large areas of land where human activity was limited, allowing animals to move and live with minimal interference. These places were not seen as empty or wasted, but as necessary parts of a healthy world. Others focused on developing ways to live more densely, building upward or inward rather than outward, to reduce the pressure on surrounding ecosystems. Cities became more compact, layered with gardens, water systems, and lookout points, rather than sprawling endlessly across the landscape. Throughout all of this, the planet itself remained an active participant. Earthquakes reshaped cities and habitats alike. Volcanic eruptions created new land and destroyed old. Storms and floods reminded everyone, human and dinosaur alike, that control was always partial and temporary. The long story of this world is not one of steady progress or simple harmony. It is a story of constant adjustment, of systems responding to systems, of lives shaped by forces far larger and far slower than any single generation can fully grasp. And yet, within that vast, slow movement, individual moments still matter. A child watching a distant herd cross a plain, a traveller standing on a cliff looking out over an ocean where large shapes break the surface in the fading light, a farmer noticing how the wind shifts just before a seasonal migration begins. These small experiences, repeated across millions of lives, form the human side of this long drifting story. They create a sense of belonging not just to a place, but to a process, a world that is always becoming something slightly different from what it was before. As you sit with this idea of an Earth that kept its giants, you might notice how it changes the way you imagine the planet itself, not as a backdrop for human history, but as a living system where human history is one thread among many. The land keeps moving, the climate keeps shifting, life keeps adapting, and somewhere in that ongoing flow, humans continue to build, learn, and wonder, always aware, at least in the back of their minds, that the ground beneath their feet has been shaped by footsteps far larger and far older than their own. Morning, in this world, rarely begins with silence. Even in the quietest stretches of forest, where mist hangs low and the air feels still enough to hold in your hands, there is always a distant presence, a low vibration in the ground that you feel before you hear, a subtle shiver in the leaves overhead, the soft rhythmic sound of something large moving far away, close enough to matter, far enough not to panic. Daily life here is shaped by that awareness. Not fear exactly, but attention. The kind of attention that becomes second nature, like breathing or blinking. People learn it as children, long before they learn to count or write. You notice the wind before you step into an open space. You listen to the birds before you cross a clearing. You feel the ground through the soles of your feet, not just as solid earth, but as a surface that carries messages. Homes in this world are built with that in mind. In forest regions, many are raised slightly above the ground, supported by thick wooden posts or stone bases, just enough to keep them out of the path of small animals and away from sudden floods. The structures are sturdy but not rigid. Walls are designed to give rather than shatter. Roofs are angled to shed heavy rain and falling branches. Doors and windows open outward easily, because leaving quickly is sometimes more important than staying secure. Villages tend to grow in clusters rather than wide spreads, a handful of homes around a shared fire space, storage areas tucked into rock faces or shallow caves, lookout points placed on higher ground, not as defensive towers in the traditional sense, but as places to watch the land breathe. From these points, someone is almost always observing, not standing guard with a weapon, but simply watching for changes in movement, sound, and pattern. The forest itself feels alive in a very direct way. Trees here are not just tall and quiet, they bear the marks of long coexistence. Some have thick, scarred trunks where bark has been rubbed away by passing animals. Others grow in twisted shapes, leaning away from well-used paths or bending over them, creating natural arches and tunnels. The undergrowth is a mix of soft plants that grow quickly and tough ones that can survive being stepped on, broken, and eaten. Foraging is a daily activity that blends into almost every other task. People know which plants grow back quickly after being disturbed, and which ones need space and time. They gather berries from bushes that thrive along the edges of animal paths, where sunlight reaches the ground. They dig for roots in places where the soil has been loosened by heavy feet. They collect fallen branches and shed feathers, using what the world leaves behind rather than taking more than they need. Children learn by walking alongside adults, not through formal lessons, but through constant exposure. A hand on a shoulder that pauses them before they step into a clearing, a quiet gesture that points out a fresh track in the mud, a whispered comment about the way the air smells just before a large herd arrives. Over time, these small moments build a deep, intuitive understanding of the environment. Cooking is a careful process, often done in sheltered areas where smoke can be directed upward and away from open spaces. Fire pits are dug into the ground or built into stone circles, designed to keep flames low and controlled. The smell of food carries far, and while it is comforting to humans, it can also draw attention from curious or hungry neighbours. Meals are often prepared in stages, with people taking turns watching the surroundings, while others tend the fire. Water is gathered with similar care. Rivers and lakes are lifelines, but they are also gathering places for animals of all sizes. People approach them slowly, watching for ripples, shadows, and changes in the behaviour of birds. Some communities build simple platforms or docks that extend slightly over the water, allowing them to collect what they need without standing directly at the edge. Others rely on narrow inlets and streams that branch off from larger bodies of water, places where fewer large animals are likely to pass through. Travel, even over short distances, is a planned activity. Paths are chosen not just for speed, but for visibility and escape options. Forest trails often follow higher ground, where you can see farther and hear more clearly. In open plains, people move along the edges of tree lines or rocky outcrops, avoiding wide, exposed areas where something large could appear without warning. Groups tend to travel together, not for strength in numbers, but for shared awareness. One person might be watching the ground, another listens to the sky, a third keeps an eye on the horizon. Movement becomes a quiet coordination, a series of small signals and adjustments, rather than loud conversation or obvious gestures. Despite all this care, there is still room for ordinary moments, laughter around a shared meal, quiet games played by children near the safety of the home, simple crafts made from bone, wood, and plant fibres. Tools are repaired, clothing is mended, stories are told not always about danger, but about everyday life, small victories and familiar places. Art in this world often reflects the presence of the giants, but not always in grand or dramatic ways. A carved handle might be shaped like a familiar animal. A woven pattern might echo the spots or stripes of a creature seen often near a river. A painted wall might show a scene of people and animals sharing the same stretch of land, not as enemies but as parts of the same picture. Music, too, has its place. Simple instruments made from hollow bones, stretched skins, and carved wood create soft sounds that blend into the natural environment rather than overpower it. Songs are often low and steady, designed to carry within a group rather than across long distances. The rhythm sometimes matches the slow, heavy pace of large animals, a subtle reflection of the world outside. In areas where the forest gives way to wide plains, daily life takes on a slightly different shape. Homes are built lower and heavier, using stone and packed earth to withstand strong winds and the occasional tremor of passing herds. Fields are planted in irregular shapes, broken up by natural barriers like streams, rocky patches, or stands of tough vegetation that animals tend to avoid. People in these regions develop a deep familiarity with the movement patterns of the herds. They know which routes are used in the dry season and which in the wet. They can often predict a large migration days in advance, based on changes in wind direction, distant sounds, or the sudden appearance of certain birds and smaller animals that move ahead of the giants. When a herd does pass close by, it becomes an event that temporarily reshapes daily life. Work pauses, children are kept close, people move to higher ground or sheltered areas, and watch as the land fills with motion and sound. The ground shakes, the air smells different. The sky might darken slightly with dust kicked up by countless feet. Afterward, the landscape is changed. Some plants are gone, others are newly exposed to sunlight. Insects swarm to fresh droppings and broken vegetation. Birds follow, and then smaller animals. Within days, life flows back into the disturbed areas, often richer than before. People return to gather what they can use, repair what was damaged, and adjust their plans based on the new shape of the land. In coastal regions, daily routines are influenced by both land and sea. Fishing is done from small, sturdy boats or from raised platforms along rocky shores. People watch the water carefully, not just for waves and weather, but for large shapes moving beneath the surface. Certain times of day and year are safer than others, and this knowledge is passed down with as much care as any skill. Homes near the coast are often built slightly inland, with clear lines of sight to the water. Warning systems, sometimes as simple as a series of drums or horns, are used to alert the community when something large approaches the shore. These sounds are not panicked or loud by default. They are steady and recognisable, signals that prompt people to move calmly and deliberately. In colder regions, where feathered dinosaurs and thick-furred mammals dominate, daily life revolves around warmth and shelter. Homes are insulated with layers of plant material, hides, and packed earth. Fires are kept burning for long stretches of time, carefully tended to conserve fuel. Clothing is layered and designed to be easily adjusted as temperatures change throughout the day. Here, the presence of large animals can be both a challenge and a resource. Shed feathers and thick hides become valuable materials. Bones from naturally deceased animals are used for tools, supports, and even musical instruments. Nothing is wasted, not out of ritual, but out of practicality. Markets and gathering places develop in these communities, often located in areas that are naturally protected from frequent animal traffic. These spaces become centres of exchange, not just for goods, but for information. News of changing migration routes, unusual animal behaviour, or shifting weather patterns spreads quickly through these networks. Over time, certain people become known for their ability to read the land and its inhabitants. They are not rulers or warriors, but observers and interpreters. Their advice is sought before major decisions are made: where to build, when to move, which routes are safe to travel. Their knowledge is built on years of paying attention to small details that others might overlook. Education in this world is deeply tied to experience. Children are encouraged to explore, but always within sight or sound of adults. They learn to identify animal tracks, not from drawings in books, but from kneeling in the mud and feeling the shape of a footprint with their hands. They learn the calls of birds and smaller dinosaurs, understanding which ones signal calm and which ones signal danger. As societies grow more complex, some of this knowledge is written down, recorded in symbols and maps, but even then, the most trusted lessons remain those learned directly from the land itself. There are moments of quiet beauty woven into all of this attention and care. An early morning where the forest is still and the only sound is the drip of dew from leaves. An evening where the sky turns deep orange and purple and large silhouettes move slowly against the fading light. A night where distant calls echo across a valley and the stars feel closer than the ground beneath your feet. These moments remind people why they stay, why they build, why they raise families in a world that demands so much awareness. There is a sense of being part of something vast, something that stretches back long before any human memory and will continue long after. Festivals and celebrations often reflect this connection. Some are timed with the arrival or departure of major herds. Others mark the change of seasons, the first snowfall, the return of migrating birds, or the blooming of certain plants. These events are not just about survival. They are about marking time in a way that feels meaningful, tied to the living world rather than to abstract numbers. Stories told during these gatherings often focus on cooperation rather than conquest. Tales of clever escapes, unexpected friendships between people and animals, or moments when paying attention saved a village from disaster. The giants of the world appear in these stories not as villains, but as powerful neighbours who must be respected and understood. As technology advances, daily life changes, but the underlying awareness remains. Machines make certain tasks easier. Communication becomes faster. Travel becomes more efficient. But the land still moves. The animals still follow their ancient routes. The ground still carries vibrations that can be felt if you know how to listen. Cities grow taller rather than wider, stacked with layers of living space, gardens and walkways. Transportation systems are designed to pass over or under major animal corridors rather than through them. Lights are shielded and directed downward at night to avoid disorienting flying and migrating creatures. In these urban environments, daily routines include both the familiar and the unusual. Morning commutes that pause briefly as a large herd crosses a distant plain visible from elevated walkways. School lessons that include real-time observation of animal behaviour through shared viewing platforms. Work days that adjust when seasonal movements bring increased activity near the city's edge. Despite the scale of everything around them, people still find comfort in small, ordinary habits. A favourite place to sit and watch the world go by. A familiar path through a garden. A quiet moment with a cup of something warm as the day begins or ends. In this world, the presence of giants does not turn every day into a struggle. Instead, it weaves a constant, steady awareness into even the simplest routines. You do not just walk, you walk while listening. You do not just build, you build while watching the horizon. You do not just live, you live while sharing space with something older, larger, and endlessly moving. As night settles in and the forest or plain grows darker, the sounds change. The daytime calls fade. New ones take their place. Fires are drawn closer together. Conversations soften. People look up at the sky, just as their ancestors did, and notice how the stars seem to hang over a world that feels both immense and intimate at the same time. Somewhere in the distance, something heavy shifts its weight. The ground responds with a quiet, familiar tremor. No one startles, no one panics. It is simply part of the world saying that it is still there, still moving, still sharing this long stretch of time. Long before anyone stood upright to watch the horizon, long before hands learned to shape stone or voices learned to shape stories, life in this world belonged to the small and the careful. Beneath towering legs and sweeping tails, under the shade of leaves that were larger than entire bodies, tiny mammals lived in a world where almost everything else was bigger, louder, and more powerful than they were. Survival did not come from strength. It came from attention, patience, and a deep familiarity with the quiet spaces that larger creatures rarely noticed. These early mammals were not heroic figures in any obvious sense. They were soft-furred, quick-footed, and mostly hidden. Their homes were not grand structures, but narrow tunnels in the earth, hollow logs and tangles of roots. Their days were often spent out of sight, resting in darkness, while the surface of the world above them pulsed with movement and sound. Night was their ally. When the great herbivores settled and the largest predators slowed their patrols, the smaller creatures emerged. Under moonlight and starlight, they searched for seeds, insects, fallen fruit, and anything else that could be carried back to safety. Their eyes adapted to low light. Their ears became finely tuned to the smallest shift in air or soil. Their whiskers read the world in a way that did not rely on sight at all, tracing the invisible shapes of obstacles and openings. In this shadowed existence, memory became one of the most valuable tools. Knowing which burrow led to a dead end and which one had a hidden exit could mean the difference between escape and capture. Recognizing the call of a bird that signaled danger versus one that meant nothing at all could save an entire group. Over time, those who remembered better, who learned faster, and who paid closer attention were more likely to survive and pass on those traits. The land itself offered both threat and opportunity. The heavy movement of dinosaurs reshaped the surface constantly. Footprints became small ponds after a rain. Fallen trees opened new paths through dense forest. Broken branches exposed fresh growth. For a small mammal, these changes could be a gift. A newly opened patch of ground might reveal insects. A hollow left by a toppled trunk could become a new home. Some species began to climb, finding safety in branches that could not support heavier bodies. Others dug deeper, creating complex tunnel systems with multiple entrances and chambers. These underground networks became small worlds of their own, complete with storage areas for food, nesting spaces for young, and escape routes for emergencies. Social behaviour grew more complex in these hidden spaces. Living alone offered quiet, but living together offered safety. Groups could take turns watching, listening, and foraging. Alarm calls developed, simple sounds that carried just far enough to warn others without drawing too much attention from predators. Over generations, these calls became more varied, able to convey not just that danger was near, but what kind of danger it was and from which direction it came. In this environment, the seeds of cooperation took root. Sharing information became as important as sharing food. A mammal that discovered a new source of nourishment or a safer route through a risky area increased not just its own chances, but the chances of everyone around it. As climates shifted and continents moved, these small mammals followed the edges of change. When forests expanded, they moved into the undergrowth. When grasslands spread, they adapted to more open terrain, relying on speed and awareness rather than cover. In colder regions, thicker fur and communal nesting helped them survive long winters. In warmer areas, nocturnal habits and burrowed shelters protected them from heat. Over vast stretches of time, some of these mammals began to change in subtle but important ways. Limbs became more flexible, digits became more independent, better suited for gripping, climbing, and manipulating small objects. Brains grew slightly larger relative to body size, allowing for better memory, learning, and social interaction. These changes did not happen because intelligence was some grand goal written into the fabric of the universe. They happened because being able to solve problems, remember patterns, and understand relationships between things was very useful in a world full of much larger neighbours. Imagine a small mammal standing at the edge of a clearing, hidden in the shadows. It watches a group of herbivores pass by, their movements slow and deliberate. The mammal notices that after the herd moves on, the ground is littered with crushed plants and exposed insects. The next time it hears the distant approach of heavy footsteps, it moves toward the path rather than away from it. Not out of bravery, but out of learned opportunity. That kind of connection between cause and effect is the beginning of a more complex way of thinking. Over time, these connections become richer. The mammal learns not just that one event follows another, but that a whole chain of changes can be anticipated. Herds bring predators. Predators bring quiet. Quiet brings the chance to move safely. As social groups become more stable, relationships within them deepen. Parents teach young where to find food and how to avoid danger. Older individuals with more experience become valuable not just for their strength or speed, but for what they know. In some species, this leads to the beginnings of something that looks like culture, a shared set of behaviours passed down not through instinct alone, but through learning. This is a slow, quiet process. There is no sudden moment where a small mammal becomes something entirely new. There is just a long line of tiny changes, each one building on the last. Eventually, in certain populations, standing up becomes useful, not for dominance, but for visibility. Being able to rise up on hind legs allows an animal to see over tall grass or low shrubs, to scan for movement in the distance. At first, this is just a brief posture, a momentary lift to check the surroundings. Over time, in some lineages, this posture becomes more common, more comfortable. Hands, once just feet with claws, begin to take on new roles. They become tools for holding, carrying, and shaping. A stone picked up and dropped becomes a way to crack open a hard shell. A stick used to poke into a narrow hole becomes a way to reach insects or small animals. These actions are not inventions in the human sense. They're extensions of curiosity and play, behaviours that already exist in many mammals. Play itself becomes an important part of development. Young animals chase each other, wrestle, and manipulate objects, not just for fun, but to practice skills they will need later. In this world, play also becomes a way to learn about the larger creatures around them. A child might mimic the slow, heavy steps of a passing herbivore, or the quick, sudden movements of a predator, turning observation into movement and memory into action. As these early human ancestors take shape, their lives remain deeply tied to the small mammal world they came from. They are still cautious. They still value shelter, cover, and quiet. Their camps are often placed near natural hiding spots such as rock formations, dense vegetation, or shallow caves. Their food sources are varied and flexible. They gather plants, dig for roots, hunt small animals, and scavenge what larger predators leave behind. They do not rely on a single type of resource, because in a world that changes with the movement of giants, depending on one thing is risky. Fire, when it appears, is a powerful but carefully managed tool. It offers warmth, light, and protection, but it also creates smell and smoke that can carry far. Early humans learned to build small, low fires, shielded by rocks or earth. They learn to move their camps if the presence of fire seems to attract too much attention. Clothing, at first simple wraps of hide or plant fibre, becomes more refined as people learn from the animals around them. Feathers inspire insulation. Thick skins suggest ways to block wind and rain. Scales influence the idea of layering and overlap in protective gear. As groups grow larger, communication becomes more complex. Sounds become signals. Gestures become language. Stories begin to form, not just about immediate dangers, but about past events, distant places, and imagined futures. These stories are often grounded in the animals that share their world. A tale about a clever escape from a predator becomes a lesson in awareness. A story about a long journey following a herd becomes a map of safe routes and seasonal patterns. The long shadows cast by the giants shape human thinking in ways that go beyond simple survival. Living in the presence of something so much larger and older encourages a sense of humility. The world does not revolve around these early humans. They are part of something much bigger, something that moves on its own terms. This perspective influences how they treat the land and each other. Resources are used carefully, not out of abstract concern, but out of practical understanding. Taking too much from one place can make it less safe in the future. Clearing too much land can remove hiding spots and protection. Everything is connected in ways that are felt directly, not just understood in theory. As time passes, humans begin to recognize patterns not just in the movement of animals, but in the movement of the seasons, the stars, and the weather. They notice that certain animals appear at the same time each year. They notice that certain plants grow best after certain events, like a herd passing through or a heavy rain. These observations lead to the beginnings of planning. Camps are set up in places that will be safe and resource-rich in the coming months. Travel is timed to avoid dangerous seasons or crowded routes. The idea of the future as something that can be prepared for takes hold. This is a subtle but important shift. Survival is no longer just about reacting to what is happening now. It becomes about anticipating what might happen next. As tools improve, humans become better at shaping their environment in small ways. They clear narrow paths through dense vegetation. They build simple barriers to guide small animals. They create storage spaces to protect food from scavengers. These changes are modest compared to the scale of the world around them, but they represent a growing sense of agency. Despite this, humans remain, for a very long time, one of the smaller players in a much larger system. They are clever, adaptable, and social, but they do not dominate the land. They live in its folds, its edges, and its quieter corners. Encounters with large dinosaurs are often moments of stillness rather than action. People freeze, lower themselves to the ground or retreat into cover. They watch the slow passage of something that could end their lives without even meaning to. These moments are remembered, talked about, and turned into stories that reinforce the importance of patience and caution. There are also moments of unexpected calm. Standing at a distance, watching a massive creature feed or rest, people sometimes feel a sense of connection rather than fear. The animal breathes. The person breathes. Both are simply alive in the same place at the same time. These experiences begin to shape early beliefs and ideas about the world. The giants become symbols of endurance, strength, and the deep past. They are not gods in a strict sense, but they are often treated with a kind of quiet respect. Their bones, when found, are kept and studied, not just as tools, but as reminders of the long story of life. As generations pass, humans grow more confident in their ability to move through this world. They explore farther, form wider networks of trade and communication, and develop more specialized roles within their communities. Some become skilled hunters of small game. Others become expert gatherers, tool makers, or observers of animal behavior. The role of the observer becomes especially valued. These are the people who spend long hours watching herds, tracking migrations, and noting changes in the environment. Their knowledge helps guide group decisions and reduces risk. Over time, this role becomes a respected position within many societies. With this growing complexity comes a deeper sense of identity. Humans begin to see themselves not just as animals among animals, but as something slightly different. Not better, not worse, but capable of reflection, of looking at the world and thinking about their place within it. This self-awareness brings new questions. Why are we like this? Why do we think and remember in this way? What is our role in a world filled with creatures so different from us? These questions do not have clear answers, but they become part of the stories people tell, part of the songs they sing, part of the quiet moments when someone sits alone and watches the land. As human societies slowly develop writing and record keeping, some of these ideas are preserved in marks on stone, wood, or hide. These early records often focus on relationships rather than events. Notes about which animals live near which rivers, which plants grow after which migrations, which times of year are safest for travel. In this way, knowledge becomes something that can outlive the people who discovered it. The long chain of learning grows stronger, connecting past and present in a way that mirrors the long, continuous presence of the giants themselves. Through all of this, the original small mammal instincts never completely fade. Even in large settlements, even with advanced tools and shared knowledge, people still listen for changes in sound. They still notice when birds fall silent. They still feel the ground when something heavy moves nearby. These habits, passed down through countless generations, remain part of what it means to be human in this world. A reminder of a time when survival depended on the smallest details, when living in the long shadows of giants shaped not just bodies and tools, but ways of thinking. As you let this slow, careful evolution settle in your thoughts, you might notice how different this path feels from the story we usually tell about ourselves. There is no sudden rise to dominance, no clear moment where humans take control of the planet. Instead, there is a long, patient learning process, shaped by coexistence rather than replacement. Not all change announces itself with noise or spectacle. Some of the most important shifts in this shared world happen quietly, in small, repeated moments that would be easy to overlook if you were not paying close attention. A hand reaching for a stone instead of a branch. A pause before crossing an open space. A look exchanged between two people that carries meaning without a single sound. Over long stretches of time, these tiny choices begin to add up, and the world slowly makes room for something new to take shape among the old. The hands of these early humans are not remarkable at first glance. They are still shaped by climbing, digging and carrying, strong in the palm, flexible in the fingers, capable of gripping rough bark and smooth stone alike. But in a world where survival depends on noticing small opportunities, those hands start to become more than just tools for moving through the environment. They become tools for changing it, even if only in the smallest ways. At first, it is simple. A stone picked up because it feels good to hold. a stick chosen because it fits comfortably in the hand. These objects are carried for no particular reason, then dropped, then picked up again. Over time, patterns emerge. A stone with a sharp edge breaks open a nut more easily. A heavier stick scares away a small predator more effectively than a light one. These are not inventions in the modern sense. They are discoveries made through repetition and attention. As these discoveries spread through groups, they become shared knowledge. Someone shows someone else how to strike one stone against another to create a sharper edge. A child watches an adult use a stick to probe a hole in the ground and tries it themselves. These moments are not formal lessons. They are part of daily life, woven into foraging, play, and travel. The presence of the giants shapes this learning in subtle ways. Large animals leave behind more than just footprints. They leave bones, shed feathers, broken branches, and disturbed ground. Each of these becomes an opportunity. Bones become tools for digging or cutting. Feathers become insulation or decoration. Hollowed out logs become shelter or storage. The world is full of materials, and clever hands begin to see possibilities where there were once just objects. Curiosity grows alongside this practical skill. People start to look at things not just for what they are, but for what they might become. A piece of stone is not just a rock, it is a blade, a hammer, a weight, or a marker. A strip of hide is not just skin, it is a strap, a bag, a cover, or a tie. This way of seeing changes how people move through the landscape. They no longer just pass through places, they notice them as sources of potential. A riverbank with smooth stones becomes a place to return to. A stand of flexible branches becomes a resource for building. A cliff face with soft rock becomes a place to carve or mark. As these habits spread, communities begin to develop areas that feel more permanent. Not cities in the sense of towering walls and endless streets, but familiar spaces shaped by repeated use. A clearing where tools are made and repaired. A sheltered spot where stories are told and plans are made. A high point where someone always goes to watch the horizon. The mind changes along with the hands. Memory becomes more detailed, not just about places and dangers, but about processes. How long it takes to shape a stone. Which type of wood burns best. How different materials behave in rain, heat, or cold. These details are stored, compared, and shared. Language grows to accommodate this new kind of thinking. Words for objects multiply. Descriptions become more precise. There are terms for different kinds of stone, different stages of a tool, different qualities of a material. Communication becomes a way to pass on not just stories, but techniques. This does not happen in isolation from the larger world. The giants remain a constant presence, and their behaviour continues to influence human development. Watching a massive herbivore use its body to push down a tree or clear a path can inspire new ways of thinking about leverage and force. Observing how a predator uses patience and timing can influence hunting strategies for smaller game. People begin to draw connections between what they see in animals and what they do themselves. A bird weaving a nest inspires new ways of tying and braiding. A creature using its tail for balance leads to ideas about posture and movement. These are not conscious studies in biology, but practical observations that feed into daily life. As groups grow larger and more stable, roles begin to emerge. Not rigid professions, but tendencies. Some people spend more time making and repairing tools. Others focus on gathering, hunting, or watching the land. Some become known for remembering stories, places, and patterns. This division of attention allows knowledge to deepen in different directions. The toolmakers, for example, start to experiment more. They try different angles when striking stone. They test how various materials hold up over time. They notice that certain shapes fit the hand better or work more efficiently. Over generations, this leads to a gradual refinement of tools, not through sudden breakthroughs, but through countless small adjustments. The presence of large animals also influences what kinds of tools are most valued. Heavy-duty tools for building and clearing become important in areas where herds regularly pass through. and reshape the land. Lightweight, portable tools are favoured by groups that move often to avoid crowded routes or dangerous zones. Shelter design evolves in similar ways. Early structures are simple, using branches, hides, and earth. Over time, people learn to build in ways that respond to the movement of the giants. Roofs are angled to deflect falling branches. Supports are placed to allow buildings to bend rather than collapse if brushed by something large. Entryways are designed to allow quick exits in multiple directions. Curious minds begin to ask questions that go beyond immediate needs. Why do certain animals return to the same places year after year? Why do some plants grow only after a herd passes through? Why does the ground feel different in some places than in others? These questions lead to the beginnings of pattern seeking. People start to track time not just by the sun and seasons but by events. The arrival of a particular herd, the blooming of a certain plant, the first cold wind from a particular direction. These markers become part of a shared calendar, one rooted in the living world rather than in abstract numbers. As writing and symbols slowly develop, these patterns are recorded. Marks on stone or wood represent routes, resources, and warnings. These early maps are not precise in the modern sense, but they capture relationships. This place connects to that place. This event follows that event. This path is safe at this time. The act of recording information changes how people think about knowledge itself. It becomes something that can exist outside a single person's memory, something that can be passed on even when the person who discovered it is gone. This creates a sense of continuity that stretches beyond individual lives. Curiosity also turns inward. People begin to reflect on themselves and their own place in this world of giants. They notice that they can imagine things that do not yet exist. They can plan for a future that is not immediately visible. They can remember a past that is no longer present. This awareness shapes early beliefs and philosophies. Some groups see themselves as caretakers of certain places or routes. Others see their role as learners, always observing and adapting. The giants often appear in these beliefs as symbols of time, endurance, and the deep past. Not as enemies to be defeated, but as reminders of how long the world has been turning. Art becomes a way to explore these ideas. Carvings and paintings show not just animals and people, but scenes of interaction. A person guiding a herd away from a camp, a group watching a migration from a hillside, a child reaching out toward a feather or a footprint. These images capture relationships rather than just forms. Music and rhythm also take on new roles. Drums and simple instruments are used not just for celebration, but for communication. Certain rhythms signal gatherings, others warn of danger. The beat of these sounds often mirrors the slow, heavy pace of the giants, creating a sense of connection between human activity and the larger movements of the world. As technology advances, even in small steps, it begins to influence how humans and dinosaurs share space. Early warning systems develop. Elevated platforms allow people to see farther. Reflective surfaces and sound-making devices help guide animals away from certain areas without direct confrontation. These innovations are not about control in the modern sense. They are about coexistence, about finding ways to live alongside something powerful without constantly coming into conflict. Education becomes more deliberate. Children are taught not just by example, but through structured activities. They practice tracking, tool-making, and observation. They learn stories that encode practical lessons. They're encouraged to ask questions and explore. The presence of the giants keeps this education grounded. No matter how clever or capable humans become, there is always a reminder of something larger. A passing herd that shakes the ground. A distant call that echoes across a valley. A shadow that moves across a field. This constant contrast shapes human ambition. Progress is not measured in how much land is conquered or how many animals are controlled. It is measured in how well people can predict, understand, and adapt to the world around them. Over time, this leads to a form of science that is deeply observational, People keep records of animal behaviour, plant growth, weather patterns, and geological changes. They compare notes across regions. They test ideas by watching what happens when they change small things, like planting a certain crop in a new place or altering a common route. This growing body of knowledge allows for more complex societies. Trade networks expand. Specialization increases. Some people focus on building, others on teaching, others on watching the land. Yet even as human communities grow larger and more connected, the early instincts remain. The habit of listening, the practice of watching the horizon, the tendency to pause before acting. These habits are woven into daily life. A meeting might be interrupted because someone notices a change in the wind. A celebration might be postponed because a migration is expected. Plans are always flexible, always responsive to the larger movements of the world. Curious minds begin to look beyond the immediate landscape. They study the sky, the stars, and the cycles of the moon. They notice how these patterns align with changes on the ground. This leads to a broader sense of connection between the heavens and the earth. The idea that everything is part of a larger system becomes more than just a practical observation. It becomes a guiding principle. Actions are considered not just for their immediate effect, but for how they might ripple outward. As writing becomes more common, these ideas are preserved in texts that combine practical guidance with reflection. Manuals on toolmaking sit alongside stories about the origins of the world. Records of migrations sit alongside poems and songs about belonging. This blending of the practical and the thoughtful becomes a hallmark of human culture in this world. Knowledge is not just about how to do things. It is about understanding why things are the way they are. The slow rise of clever hands and curious minds does not lead to a sudden turning point where humans step into a new age. Instead, it creates a gradual shift in how humans see themselves. They are no longer just small mammals in long shadows. They are observers, planners, builders, and storytellers. They are part of a long shared history that includes both their own ancestors and the ancient beasts that still walk the land. As this awareness grows, new possibilities begin to appear on the horizon. Ideas about shaping the future, not just reacting to it. About building systems that last beyond a single lifetime. About finding ways to protect not just human communities, but the larger web of life they depend on. Those ideas are still forming, still fragile, still influenced by the steady presence of something much older and larger, moving through the same world. Across this long unfolding world, the land itself becomes a kind of meeting place. Not a border between human and dinosaur, not a line that separates one way of life from another, but a wide open space where many kinds of movement, many kinds of need, and many kinds of memory overlap and leave their marks. Rivers, plains, and skies are not owned by any one species. They are shared, shaped by every footstep, wing beat, and quiet decision to stay or move on. Rivers, first of all, carry more than water. They carry stories written in mud, stones, and the worn edges of their banks. A river in this world is rarely a calm, empty ribbon. It is a gathering place. The giants come to drink, their heads lowering slowly, their reflections breaking and reforming on the surface. Smaller animals hover at the edges, waiting for moments of safety. Birds line the branches overhead, watching for fish or insects stirred up by the movement below. For humans, the river is both gift and test. It offers water, food, and a natural path through the landscape. It also draws attention. Approaching it means stepping into a space where many lives intersect. The sound of water can hide the sound of footsteps. The smell of wet earth can mask the scent of something large and nearby. Communities near rivers learn to build in ways that respect this constant flow of traffic. Homes are set back from the main banks, tucked behind rises in the land or stands of thick vegetation. Footpaths approach the water at angles rather than directly, allowing people to see and hear what might already be there before stepping into the open. Fishing, in this world, is an exercise in patience and timing. Nets and traps are placed in quieter inlets rather than in the main current. People watch the patterns of animal movement, choosing moments when the giants have moved on or are resting elsewhere. Sometimes fishing is delayed not by weather, but by the simple fact that the river is too busy to safely approach. The banks themselves change constantly. Heavy feet turn soft soil into deep impressions that fill with water after rain. Over time, these small pools become homes for insects, frogs and plants that thrive in shallow temporary wetlands. Birds follow, and then small mammals, and suddenly a place that was once just a footprint becomes a tiny living system of its own. Plains, by contrast, feel open in a way that is both inviting and exposed. Here the sky seems larger, the horizon stretches farther. The movement of herds is easier to see but also harder to avoid. On these wide spaces, the giants often travel in long, slow lines, their paths visible from great distances as dark, moving shapes against the lighter ground. For humans, crossing a plain is an act that requires preparation. Routes are chosen based on the time of year, the direction of the wind, and the known patterns of migration. Camps on the plains are temporary, set up for a night or two at most, often near natural features like rocky outcrops or small clusters of trees that offer both shelter and a better view of what is coming. The grass itself tells a story. In some areas, it grows short and tough, shaped by constant grazing and trampling. In others, it grows tall and soft, in places where herds pass less often. These differences guide both animals and people, pointing towards safer paths or more dangerous ones. Predators on the plains move differently than in forests. There is less cover, less opportunity for ambush. Speed and coordination become more important. Humans learn to read these patterns as well, recognizing when a sudden stillness in the distance might mean a hunt is about to begin. The sky above the plains is rarely empty. Birds of many kinds circle, glide and dart, their movements often reflecting what is happening on the ground. A sudden gathering of wings can signal a feeding opportunity. A sudden scattering can signal danger. People learn to watch the sky as carefully as they watch the land. The behavior of birds becomes an early warning system. Certain calls mean that something large is approaching. Certain flight patterns mean that a predator is on the move. This attention to the sky becomes so ingrained that it happens without conscious effort, a habit passed down from one generation to the next. Forests too play their part in this shared landscape, but they do so in a different way. Where plains are about distance and visibility, forests are about closeness and concealment. Here, the giants move more slowly, picking their way between trees, pushing through undergrowth, and leaving behind narrow corridors of flattened plants and broken branches. These corridors become natural pathways not just for animals, but for people. They offer easier travel through dense areas, but they also come with risk. A path that is easy for you is easy for something else as well. Every step along these routes is taken with an ear tuned for sound and an eye scanning for movement ahead. The forest canopy shapes the light in shifting patterns. Sunbeams break through in bright patches that move as the day passes. These patches often mark places where large animals have opened the canopy by breaking or pushing aside branches. Over time, plants that need more light grow in these spots, creating pockets of different vegetation within the larger forest. Humans learn to use these pockets. Some become gathering places for food. Others become natural meeting points or resting areas. The forest becomes a patchwork of familiar landmarks, each one shaped by a combination of natural growth and animal movement. Skies in this world are not just a background. They are an active part of the shared environment. Large flying creatures descended from feathered dinosaurs move between forests, plains, and coasts. Some soar high, riding warm air currents. Others stay closer to the ground, skimming over water or through open spaces. For people, these creatures are both a wonder and a source of information. Their movements often reflect changes in weather or animal activity below. A sudden shift in flight patterns can signal an approaching storm or the movement of a large herd. In some regions, humans build simple platforms or towers, not just to watch the land, but to watch the sky. These vantage points become places of learning, where children and adults alike spend time observing how different creatures move, interact, and respond to their environment. As human societies grow, these shared landscapes become more deliberately managed, though never fully controlled. Corridors are left open for animal movement, sometimes marked by simple signs or structures that remind people not to build or farm in those areas. Rivers are kept clear of certain kinds of development to preserve access for both humans and animals. Plains near growing settlements are often divided into zones. Some are used for crops or grazing small domesticated animals. Others are left open for the passage of herds. This division is not always neat or respected, and conflicts do arise. Crops are trampled, fences are broken, buildings are damaged. When this happens, the response is rarely about punishment or domination. It's more often about adjustment. Fields are moved, barriers are redesigned, warning systems are improved. The landscape is treated as something that both sides must negotiate with, rather than something that can be permanently claimed. Trade routes develop along the safer paths through these shared spaces. Merchants and travellers move between communities carrying goods, stories and news. These routes often follow rivers or skirt the edges of major animal corridors, balancing ease of travel with safety. Along these routes, way stations appear. Simple shelters, storage areas, and lookout points that offer rest and information. Maps are kept here, not as static documents, but as living records, updated with notes about recent migrations, dangerous areas, and changes in the land. Over time, these shared landscapes shape human culture in visible ways. Clothing reflects the environment. Patterns mimic the textures of grass, bark, and sky. Architecture echoes the forms of natural shelters, with curved roofs, layered walls, and open spaces that allow for both light and escape. Language, too, carries the imprint of this world. There are many words for different kinds of movement, different kinds of tracks, different qualities of wind and sound. Directions are often given in relation to natural features rather than abstract points. You go toward the river, away from the herd path, past the tall rocks where the birds gather. Stories and myths grow out of the landscape. A river bend becomes the setting for a tale about a clever escape. A wide plain becomes the backdrop for a story about a long journey. A mountain becomes a symbol of endurance, its slow rise and fall mirroring the long presence of the giants. As writing becomes more common, these stories are preserved, but they remain closely tied to place. Reading a story is not just about imagining an event, it is about recognizing the land where it happened, or where it could have happened. The landscape itself becomes a kind of book, with chapters written in stone, water, and growth. Education in this world often involves moving through these shared spaces. Children are taken on long walks along rivers, across plains and through forests, learning not just the names of plants and animals, but the patterns of interaction between them. They learn where herds usually cross a river. They learn which birds signal a change in weather. They learn how the land looks before and after a major migration. These lessons are practical, but they also shape how people think about their place in the world. The idea of being part of a larger system becomes more than a concept. It becomes something you can see and feel in every footprint and every ripple on the water. As cities grow, they do so with an awareness of these shared landscapes. Urban areas are often designed with green corridors that connect to larger natural spaces, allowing animals to move through or around them. Parks and open areas are not just for human recreation. They are part of a broader network that supports movement and interaction across the land. Transportation systems reflect this as well. Roads are elevated or tunnelled in key areas to avoid blocking major routes. Bridges are built with enough clearance for large animals to pass beneath. In some places, entire sections of infrastructure are designed to move or be removed if patterns of migration change. Technology adds new layers to this relationship. Sensors and observation tools allow people to track animal movements over large distances. Communication networks spread this information quickly, helping communities prepare for changes in their surroundings. Despite this, the fundamental experience of these shared landscapes remains rooted in direct observation. You still feel the wind on your face. You still hear the distant rumble of movement. You still see the way light changes across the land as the day passes. Festivals and gatherings often take place in open spaces that highlight this connection. People come together on plains to watch the arrival of herds. They gather along rivers to celebrate the return of certain fish or birds. They climb hills to watch the sky during important seasonal events. These moments reinforce a sense of belonging, not just to a community, but to a place within a larger whole. They remind people that their lives are intertwined with patterns that stretch back far beyond any single memory. As generations pass, the shared landscapes themselves become part of human identity. People describe themselves in relation to the land they come from. River people, plain walkers, forest dwellers, coastal watchers. These labels reflect not just geography, but a way of life shaped by the presence of the giants and the spaces they move through. Conflicts do arise, especially as populations grow and resources become more contested. Different groups may have different ideas about how to use a particular area. A river that one community sees as a trade route might be seen by another as a sacred gathering place for animals. Negotiations, agreements, and sometimes struggles shape the political landscape of this world. Even in these moments, the presence of the giants often serves as a reminder of shared limits. A large migration can disrupt both sides equally. A sudden change in climate can force cooperation rather than competition. The land itself, shaped by forces beyond human control, continues to set the terms of what is possible. As you imagine these rivers, plains, and skies filled with scales and footprints, you might notice how different this feels from a world divided into strictly human and non-human spaces. Here the boundaries are softer. A city edge might fade into a grazing field. A forest path might become a migration route. A riverbank might be both a market and a watering hole. This blending creates a constant sense of awareness. You're never entirely in a human-only world. You're always sharing space with something else, something that moves, eats, rests, and lives according to its own rhythms. Over time, this shapes a particular kind of calm. Not the calm of control, but the calm of familiarity. You learn what to expect, even when you cannot predict everything. You learn that the land will change, that animals will move, that weather will shift. This acceptance becomes part of daily life. Plans are made, but they are flexible. Structures are built, but they are adaptable. Knowledge is gathered, but it is always open to revision. As evening falls over these shared landscapes, the light softens. The sky deepens in colour. Shadows stretch across plains and through forests. The river reflects the last of the sun before turning dark and quiet. People settle into their homes or camps. Fires are lit. Conversations begin. Somewhere in the distance, a herd moves slowly, its presence felt more than seen. In these moments, the world feels both vast and close. The shared landscape, shaped by countless lives, continues to hold everyone within it, from the smallest insect to the largest giant, from the newest child to the oldest memory. Long before walls grew tall and streets stretched wide, before cities cast their own shadows across the land, there were three things that shaped nearly every human decision in this world: fire, shelter, and fear. Not fear as a constant state of panic, but fear as awareness, as respect for what moves beyond your control. These three were not separate parts of life. They were woven together, forming the quiet framework around which early humans learned to exist beside creatures that felt less like animals and more like living pieces of the land itself. Fire, first of all, was never just warmth. In a world shared with giants, flame became a signal as much as a tool. A small, steady glow in the dark told others where you were. A line of low fires along the edge of a camp could suggest a boundary without building a wall. Smoke drifting upward could warn of danger or guide someone home. People learned quickly that fire was something to be handled gently, carefully, with intention rather than impulse. Early fires were not roaring bonfires. They were quiet, controlled, often hidden in shallow pits or behind stones. The goal was not to light up the night, but to create a pocket of warmth and light that did not carry too far. The smell of burning wood could travel on the wind, and in this world, scent was a language many creatures understood very well. Children were taught early how to tend a flame, how to feed it slowly, how to shield it from sudden gusts of wind, how to put it out completely when it was no longer needed. Fire was treated almost like a living thing, something that had its own behaviour and needed to be watched, not just used. Shelter grew out of the same careful mindset. Early homes were not built to stand forever. They were built to respond. Structures leaned into the land rather than rising above it. Walls were thick enough to block wind and rain, but flexible enough to bend if brushed by something heavy. Roofs were angled to shed water and falling branches. Openings were placed in more than one direction, so leaving quickly was always an option. In forest regions, shelters often tucked themselves into natural features. A rocky outcrop became a back wall. A fallen tree became a roof support. Dense vegetation became a screen that hid the structure from a distance. The idea was not to make a statement, but to blend in, to become just another shape in a world full of shapes. On open plains, where hiding was harder, homes became lower and heavier. Earth was piled against walls for stability and insulation. Stone was used where it was available, not for grandeur but for strength and predictability. These shelters felt less like houses and more like extensions of the ground itself. In colder regions, people learned to layer their homes the same way they layered their clothing. Plant fibres, hides, packed soil and snow were used together to trap warmth. Openings were kept small. Fires were placed at the centre, with smoke guided out through narrow channels or vents in the roof. Fear, in this world, was not something to be conquered. It was something to be listened to. There were moments when fear arrived suddenly. A shadow moving too fast across a clearing. A low rumble felt through the soles of your feet. A sudden silence in the forest where there had been birdsong just a moment before. In these moments, people froze, lowered themselves, or retreated without discussion. The body knew what to do before the mind had time to argue, but most of the time fear lived in the background, like a quiet companion. It shaped how people chose where to walk, where to build, where to rest. It encouraged them to look twice, listen longer, and move a little more slowly than they might otherwise. This kind of fear did not weaken people. It sharpened them. Daily routines reflected this awareness in small, consistent ways. Someone gathering water would never go alone without telling others where they were going. Someone walking beyond the edge of a settlement would carry something that could make noise or light if needed. Children were rarely out of sight, not because the world was seen as evil, but because it was seen as powerful. As communities grew, these habits became traditions. Morning often began with a quiet check of the surroundings. Not a formal patrol, but a walk along familiar paths, a climb to a lookout point, a moment spent watching the horizon. These small rituals grounded people in the present. They reminded them that the world did not stop moving just because they had slept. Shelters were maintained constantly, roofs were reinforced, walls were checked for cracks, paths were cleared of fallen branches. These tasks were not seen as chores to be rushed through. They were part of staying in conversation with the land. Fire, again, played a central role in community life. At night, people gathered around shared flames. This was when stories were told, knowledge was passed on, and plans were made. The light created a small circle of visibility in a much larger dark, a place where faces could be seen and voices could be heard clearly. Many of the stories told in these circles focused on close encounters. Someone who watched a herd pass so close they could see individual scars and markings. someone who followed a predator's tracks for hours without ever seeing the animal itself, someone who made a mistake and learned from it. These stories were not meant to frighten, they were meant to teach. They carried practical lessons hidden inside personal experiences. Do not camp near this kind of valley. Do not cross a river at this time of year. Do not ignore this kind of sound. Over time, the stories became a shared library of knowledge, a way of preserving information in a form that was easy to remember and repeat. As tools and techniques improved, people began to experiment with ways to make their presence clearer to the animals around them. This might sound backward at first, but in many cases being predictable was safer than being invisible. Certain sounds like low, steady drumming or rhythmic clapping were used to announce human presence in dense forests or near rivers. The goal was not to scare, but to avoid surprising something large and potentially dangerous. Animals that knew you were there could choose to avoid you. Animals that were startled might react without thinking. This idea extended to visual signals as well. Poles with hanging objects that moved in the wind were placed near camps and fields. Reflective surfaces, made from polished stone or shells, caught the light and created small flashes that could be seen from a distance. These signals marked human space without creating hard barriers. Shelter design also began to incorporate these ideas. Some communities built outer rings of simple structures, not meant to be lived in, but to create a buffer zone. These might be lines of stacked stone, low fences of branches, or shallow trenches. They were not strong enough to stop something large, but they were enough to slow it, redirect it, or at least make noise. Fear in these cases became a source of creativity rather than paralysis. In some regions, people learned to read and even guide the movement of animals more directly. By planting certain kinds of vegetation or leaving specific areas open, they could encourage herds to follow particular paths. These efforts were never perfect, and they required constant adjustment, but they gave people a small amount of influence over the flow of the world around them. Children growing up in this environment developed a unique sense of play. Their games often involved pretending to be animals, mimicking movements, sounds, and behaviours. This was not just imagination, it was practice. It taught them how different creatures moved, how fast they could turn, how they reacted to certain sounds or gestures. Through play, children learned what adults knew through experience, where it was safe to hide, when it was better to stand still, how to move quietly, how to move loudly on purpose. Education in this sense was not separated from daily life. It happened constantly, in every task and every moment of attention. As time went on, some communities began to build more complex forms of shelter, especially in areas where populations grew and space became more limited. Multi-level structures appeared, with living spaces above storage and work areas. Raised walkways connected buildings, allowing people to move without always being on the ground. These designs served multiple purposes. They provided better views of the surrounding land. They created clear paths for human movement. They also reduced the chance of sudden encounters at ground level. In some places, entire settlements were built on stilts or platforms, especially near wetlands and rivers. This kept people above seasonal floods and away from certain animals, while still allowing easy access to water and food sources. Fire, in these more developed communities, took on additional roles. It was used for crafting, for cooking more complex meals, and for creating materials like hardened clay and refined metals. These advances brought new tools, new building methods, and new possibilities. But even as technology advanced, the careful relationship with fire remained. Large, uncontrolled flames were still avoided in most settled areas. The risk of drawing attention or causing damage was too great. Fear, too, evolved. As people became more capable, some of the immediate dangers became easier to manage. Better shelters, better tools, and better communication reduced the risk of sudden disaster. But fear did not disappear. It shifted. Now people worried about larger patterns, changes in migration routes, unusual animal behaviour, long periods without rain, colder winters or hotter summers. These were signs that something in the larger system might be changing. Communities began to hold regular gatherings to discuss these observations. Elders, observers and travellers shared what they had seen. Decisions were made collectively about where to move, what to plant, and how to prepare. In these meetings, the presence of the giants was often central. A shift in the behaviour of a major herd could affect multiple regions. A decline in a certain species could signal broader environmental trouble. This awareness led to the beginnings of something like environmental stewardship. Some areas were set aside as shared spaces, where human activity was limited to allow animals to feed, rest, or breed without disturbance. These decisions were not always easy, especially when resources were scarce, but they were driven by a long-term view shaped by living in a world where change could take generations to unfold. Spiritual beliefs and traditions grew out of this relationship as well. Many cultures developed rituals around fire, shelter, and the presence of the giants. Fire was seen as a link between the human world and the wider one, a way of transforming what was found in the land into something that could sustain life. Shelter became a symbol of belonging, not just to a group, but to a place. The act of building and maintaining a home was often accompanied by ceremonies that acknowledged the land and the creatures that shared it. The giants themselves took on a range of meanings. In some stories, they were teachers, showing humans how to move, how to endure, how to live in the long view of time. In others, they were reminders of limits, of the fact that no matter how clever or organised humans became, there would always be forces beyond their control. As societies became more complex, these beliefs did not fade. They adapted. Temples and public spaces incorporated imagery of animals and natural patterns. Festivals were timed with migrations, solstices, and seasonal changes. Firelight continued to play a role in these gatherings, illuminating faces, casting shadows that danced along walls and across the ground. In these moments, people felt connected not just to each other, but to the long chain of life that stretched back into the deep past. There were, of course, moments of tragedy, encounters that went wrong, structures that failed, warnings that were missed or misunderstood. These moments became part of the collective memory as well, shaping future decisions and reinforcing the importance of attention and care. Over time, as writing and record-keeping became more common, some of these experiences were documented, not as dry lists of events, but as narratives that combined practical advice with reflection. A record of a flood might include not just the damage done, but what was learned about where to build next time. A record of an animal encounter might include not just what happened, but what could have been done differently. This blending of experience and thought became a defining feature of human culture in this world. As you imagine these early communities, gathered around low fires, sheltered by walls that lean into the land, listening for distant movement in the dark, you might notice how different their sense of security feels from our own. Safety here is not about eliminating risk. It is about living with it, understanding it, and responding to it with care rather than denial. The presence of the giants makes this approach unavoidable. You cannot pretend that the world is small or predictable when something large enough to shake the ground can wander past your home. Instead, people learn to see themselves as part of a larger rhythm. They build, rest, and move in response to patterns that stretch beyond a single day or season. As generations pass, this way of life creates a deep sense of continuity. Children grow up hearing the same stories, tending the same fires, and repairing the same kinds of shelters that their grandparents did. At the same time, they add their own experiences and observations to the shared knowledge. The world changes, tools improve, communities grow, but the core relationship remains. Fire still glows softly in the night, shelters still lean into the land. Fear still whispers reminders to pay attention. And somewhere beyond the circle of light, something large and ancient moves through the darkness, a living legend that does not know or care about the stories told around human fires, yet continues to shape them all the same. Stories in this world do not begin on paper or in stone. They begin in the air, carried by breath, shaped by voices that rise and fall around quiet fires and shared meals. They begin with a shadow moving across the ground, a low sound felt more than heard, a set of footprints pressed deep into soft earth. Long before humans had words for stars, numbers, or distant lands, they had stories about the giants that walked beside them. In the earliest days, these stories were simple. They were not grand myths or complex belief systems. They were memories turned into lessons. Someone would describe the way a large animal paused at a river bend before drinking. Someone else would talk about how a certain bird always flew ahead of a herd. These accounts were practical, rooted in observation, meant to help the next person make it safely through the day. Over time, something else began to grow within them. As generations passed, people started to notice that these stories did more than just pass on information. They created a shared way of seeing the world. They gave meaning to experiences that were otherwise just moments of movement and sound. A sudden storm during a migration became more than a change in weather. It became a sign. A rare encounter with a massive, solitary creature became more than a lucky sighting. It became a moment worth remembering, repeating, and wondering about. Bones played a powerful role in this shift. In this world, bones were not just remnants of a vanished age. They were part of the living landscape. People found them along riverbanks, in eroded hillsides, and in the open spaces where animals had fallen and returned to the earth. A single rib could be longer than a person was tall. A skull could be as wide as a shelter. These remains carried weight, both physical and symbolic. Holding a bone from something so large, something that once walked, breathed and moved through the same world, stirred questions that did not have easy answers. What kind of life had this creature lived? Where had it gone? What did it see when it looked out over the land? Bones became objects of attention. Some were used as tools or building supports, but others were kept, displayed, or placed in special locations. A large skull might be set near a gathering place. A line of vertebrae might mark the entrance to a path. These were not decorations in the modern sense. They were reminders, markers of presence, signs that this world had a long memory. As these practices spread, stories began to grow around them. A particular bone might be linked to a tale about a great journey. A set of footprints preserved in stone might be said to mark the path of an ancient guardian. Over time, these stories layered meaning onto the landscape itself. Breath too took on significance. In a world where so much of life was defined by movement and sound, breath became a powerful symbol. The slow, deep breathing of a resting giant. The quick, nervous breaths of a human hiding in the undergrowth. The shared rhythm of a group gathered around a fire on a cold night. People began to see breath as a sign of connection between all living things. Everything that lived breathed the same air. The wind that carried the scent of a herd across a valley was the same wind that cooled a human face. This idea found its way into early beliefs, shaping how people thought about life, death, and the space in between. As language developed, words for breath and wind often overlapped. The same sound might be used to describe both. This reflected a growing sense that life itself was something that moved through the world, invisible but felt, much like the presence of the giants. Stories began to move beyond practical lessons and into the realm of explanation. Why were the giants so large? Why did they move the way they did? Why did some stay in one place while others travelled across entire regions? Different communities answered these questions in different ways. In some places, people believed that the giants were shaped by the land itself, formed from mountains, rivers, and forests given life. In others, they were seen as the first inhabitants of the world, older siblings to humanity, who had been given the task of shaping the earth before humans arrived. Some stories spoke of a time when humans and giants could understand each other, when a shared language existed between scale and skin. These tales often ended with that connection being lost, not through anger or betrayal, but through simple change. The world grew more complex, the creatures grew more different, the shared understanding faded. These stories were not meant to be taken as literal history. They were ways of expressing a relationship, a sense of closeness mixed with distance, of familiarity mixed with awe. Symbols began to emerge from these beliefs. Certain animals became associated with specific ideas. A large, slow-moving herbivore might represent patience and endurance. A fast, sharp-toothed predator might symbolize alertness and decisiveness. A flying creature might be linked to messages, change, or the connection between sky and land. These symbols found their way into art, clothing, and tools. A carved handle might bear the shape of a familiar animal, not just for decoration, but as a reminder of the qualities it represented. A woven pattern might echo the markings of a creature associated with protection or good fortune. Rituals grew around these ideas. Before a long journey, people might gather and tell stories about animals known for travelling far and safely. Before planting a field, they might speak of herbivores that brought new growth in their wake. These practices were not formal ceremonies with strict rules. They were flexible, shaped by local traditions and personal experiences. Children learned these stories as part of daily life. They heard them while helping prepare food, while sitting near the fire, while walking along familiar paths. Over time, they began to tell the stories themselves, adding their own details, their own observations. This constant retelling kept the stories alive, changing and adapting just as the world itself did. In some regions, especially where large bones were common, people built places around them. A natural cave that held a massive skeleton might become a gathering site. A hillside scattered with fossilized footprints might be treated as a place of reflection. These sites were not necessarily seen as sacred in a strict sense, but they were treated with care and attention. People would travel to these places not just to see them, but to feel connected to something larger. Standing beside a set of footprints that had been pressed into soft ground thousands of years before, then turned to stone, created a sense of time that stretched beyond any single life. It reminded people that the world they lived in had a deep past and, likely, a long future. As writing and record-keeping developed, some of these stories were preserved in more permanent forms. Early texts often mixed practical knowledge with symbolic language. A description of an animal's migration route might be written alongside a story about what that journey meant. A record of a harsh winter might include both the number of animals lost and a tale about resilience and renewal. This blending of observation and belief became a defining feature of human culture in this world. Knowledge and meaning were not separated. They grew together. Different regions developed different traditions shaped by the animals and landscapes around them. In coastal areas, large marine reptiles and flying creatures featured heavily in stories. The sea was often described as a place of great depth and mystery, home to beings that move between worlds of water and air. In mountain regions, animals that navigated steep terrain became symbols of balance and strength. Stories focused on the idea of finding safe paths through difficult places, both physically and in life. On wide plains, the great herds took centre stage. Their long migrations became metaphors for life's journey, for the idea that movement and change were natural and necessary parts of existence. These regional differences created a rich tapestry of beliefs, but there were common threads that ran through many of them. Respect for the giants, attention to the land, an understanding that humans were part of a much larger story. As societies grew more complex and began to interact more frequently, these different traditions met and mixed. Travellers carried stories from one region to another. Merchants shared tales along with goods. Over time, some symbols and ideas spread widely, while others remained tied to specific places. This exchange sometimes led to new interpretations. A symbol that meant one thing in a forest community might take on a different meaning in a coastal one. These differences were not usually seen as problems. They were seen as reflections of the many ways the world could be experienced. Festivals and gatherings became important moments for sharing and celebrating these stories. People came together to listen, perform, and remember. Drums, simple instruments, and chants were used to set a rhythm, often echoing the steady pace of large animals or the flow of a river. During these events, the line between story and reality sometimes blurred. A performance might involve people wearing masks or costumes inspired by familiar animals, moving in ways that reflected their behaviour. These moments allowed people to step, briefly, into the role of the giants, to feel what it might be like to move with such weight or grace. These experiences deepened the sense of connection between humans and the creatures around them. They reinforced the idea that while humans and dinosaurs were different, they shared the same world, the same air, the same cycles of day and night. As technology advanced, some of these traditions changed. Writing became more common, records became more detailed, stories could be preserved in more fixed forms. This brought both stability and loss. On one hand, stories could now travel farther and last longer. On the other, they became less flexible, less shaped by each telling. Some communities made a point of continuing oral traditions alongside written ones, believing that a story told by a living voice carried something that a mark on a page could not. Education systems developed that included both practical knowledge and cultural stories. Children learned how to track animals and build shelters, but they also learned the myths and symbols that shaped their community's understanding of the world. In these lessons, dinosaurs were not presented as distant, abstract creatures. They were part of the living present. A teacher might point to a real animal moving in the distance and connect it to a story about patience or strength. The world itself became a classroom. As cities grew, public spaces were often decorated with imagery drawn from these traditions. Walls were carved with scenes of humans and animals sharing landscapes. Statues depicted familiar forms, not as objects of worship, but as representations of qualities admired and remembered. Even in more modern settings, these symbols remained part of daily life. A pattern on a piece of clothing, a carving on a doorframe, a phrase in common speech that referenced an animal's behaviour. Language itself carried these influences. Expressions about strength, speed, patience, or change often drew on the traits of the giants. To say someone walked like the herd might mean they were steady and reliable. To say someone watched like the hunter might mean they were careful and observant. In times of uncertainty or crisis, people often turned back to these stories and symbols. They looked for guidance in tales of past challenges, of harsh winters, long migrations, or difficult encounters. These stories provided not just comfort, but a sense of continuity, a reminder that others had faced hard moments before and found ways to move forward. As you imagine this world, where myths are written in bone and breath, you might notice how closely belief and environment are tied together. The stories people tell are shaped by what they see, hear, and live with every day. In a world where giants still walk the land, it is natural for those giants to walk through the human imagination as well. The land itself becomes a kind of storyteller. A set of footprints in drying mud tells a story of movement. A cluster of bones tells a story of life and death. A scarred tree tells a story of passing herds. Humans, in turn, become interpreters of these signs, weaving them into narratives that help make sense of a complex shared world. These stories do not always have clear endings. They do not always offer simple answers. Often, they leave space for questions, for wonder, for the idea that not everything needs to be fully understood to be respected. As night falls and people gather once more around low, steady fires, the stories continue. A voice begins, others listen. Shadows flicker across faces and walls. Somewhere beyond the circle of light, something large moves, breath rising and falling in the dark. The story being told blends with the world itself, and for a moment it is hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. And as the last words of one tale fade into the quiet, there is already a pause, a space where the next story can begin, shaped by whatever new footprint, new encounter, or new question tomorrow will bring. Civilization in this world does not rise in the middle of empty land. It grows along the edges of forests where paths open into clearings, along the edges of plains where the horizon stretches wide and movement can be seen from far away, along the edges of rivers where water brings life, travel and constant activity. Cities here are not built to replace the wild. They are built to lean against it, to find a place where human structure and ancient movement can exist side by side without constantly colliding. The earliest cities begin as nothing more than familiar gathering points, a river crossing where people meet to trade, a sheltered valley where herds pass less often, a stretch of high ground where you can see in every direction. Over time, these places attract more people, more tools, more stories. What starts as a seasonal camp becomes a permanent settlement, not because anyone plans it that way, but because enough people decide that this place feels like a good one to return to. As these settlements grow, the presence of the giants shapes every decision. Streets are not laid out in perfect grids. They curve, bend, and split, following the natural features of the land and avoiding well-used animal routes. Buildings are not packed tightly together without thought. Open spaces are left between clusters, not just as plazas for people, but as breathing room for the world around them. From above, if you could look down, these cities would resemble patterns rather than blocks. Circles, arcs, and winding lines that reflect the movement of rivers, the shape of hills, and the flow of paths worn by countless feet over long periods of time. At the centre of most cities is a shared space, a place where people gather for trade, discussion and celebration. This space is often open to the sky, allowing for clear sight lines in all directions. It is here that news travels fastest. A change in migration routes, an unusual storm pattern, a discovery made far away. Information, in this world, is as valuable as food or tools. Around this central area, neighbourhoods form based on function rather than strict separation. Toolmakers might live near builders, traders near travellers, observers near high points or watch platforms. This arrangement allows knowledge and skills to flow easily from one part of the city to another. The buildings themselves reflect a balance between permanence and flexibility. Foundations are strong, often made of stone or packed earth, designed to last through seasons of rain, heat, and cold. Upper structures are lighter, using wood, woven materials, and hides that can be repaired or replaced more easily. This layered approach means that when something goes wrong, when a storm hits or a large animal brushes past the edge of the city, damage can be contained. A wall might fall, but the foundation remains. A roof might be lost, but the structure beneath it holds. Height becomes an important feature of city design, but not in the way of tall towers meant to impress. Elevated walkways, platforms and lookout points appear throughout urban spaces. These allow people to move above ground level, offering both safety and a broader view of the surroundings. From these vantage points, someone is almost always watching the land, not as a guard in a military sense, but as an observer. Their role is to notice changes, a herd moving in an unusual direction, a shift in bird behaviour, a dust cloud on the horizon that does not match the wind. These observations are shared quickly, often through simple signalling systems, flags, reflective panels, sound signals, or light at night. The goal is not to create alarm, but to create awareness. Transportation within and between cities reflects the same careful planning. Roads are built wide and clear in some areas, narrow and winding in others. Where a major animal corridor crosses a human route, the human path is often elevated or tunnelled. Bridges are designed not just for people and carts, but for large animals to pass beneath without feeling trapped or funneled into narrow spaces. Some cities even include dedicated animal corridors, wide open strips of land that cut through or around the urban area. These corridors are left largely undeveloped, allowing herds and other animals to move without passing too close to human homes and markets. At first, these design choices are driven by practicality. Over time, they become part of cultural identity. A city is known not just for its people or its trade, but for how it fits into the land. Some are known for their wide green paths that run like rivers through the streets, others for their high platforms that offer views across plains and forests. Markets in these cities are lively but carefully arranged. Stalls are grouped in ways that keep strong smells and loud noises away from the edges of the city where they might draw unwanted attention. Trade goods include not just food and tools, but materials gathered from the world of the giants: shed feathers, polished bones, hardened scales. These items are used for clothing, decoration and crafting, and they often carry symbolic meanings as well. Trade networks connect distant regions, creating long chains of exchange that stretch across continents. A feather from a flying creature in a coastal city might end up in a mountain settlement far away. A stone tool made near a river might be carried across plains and forests, passed from one community to another. With this exchange comes the spread of ideas. Building techniques, farming methods and stories travel along these routes. A way of guiding herds developed in one region might be adapted in another. A design for a shelter that works well in cold climates might be modified for use in warmer areas. As cities grow larger, they begin to require more organised systems of management. Water is channeled through canals and reservoirs. Waste is directed away from living areas. Food storage facilities are built to protect supplies from both pests and weather. These systems are designed with an awareness of the larger environment. Canals are built to avoid disrupting animal access to rivers. Waste areas are placed far from major routes. Storage buildings are reinforced to withstand both storms and curious wildlife. The idea of governance in this world often grows out of the role of observation and coordination. Leaders are not just those who can command, but those who can understand and respond to patterns. A person who can accurately predict a major migration or a long drought gains influence not through force, but through trust. Councils and gatherings are common, where representatives from different parts of the city and surrounding areas come together to share information and make decisions. These meetings often include observers who focus specifically on the behaviour of animals and the state of the land. This integration of environmental awareness into governance shapes how laws and rules develop. Regulations might limit building in certain areas, they might set aside land for migration corridors, they might control how much of a certain resource can be taken from a given area. These rules are not always popular. There are times when people want to expand, build and grow faster than the land seems to allow. Conflicts arise between short-term needs and long-term stability. In some cities, these tensions lead to periods of rapid growth, followed by periods of correction, when damage to the surrounding environment forces people to pull back and rebuild in different ways. These cycles become part of the city's history, remembered in stories, records, and even in the layout of streets and buildings. Education becomes increasingly important in these urban settings. Schools and learning centres appear, not just to teach reading, writing and numbers, but to pass on knowledge about the world outside the city walls. Students learn about migration patterns, plant cycles, weather systems, and the behaviour of different animals. Field learning remains a central part of this education. Children and young adults are taken beyond the city edges to observe the land directly. They learn to read tracks, watch the sky, and understand the signs of change. This connection to the outside world helps prevent cities from becoming completely inward-focused. There is a constant reminder that no matter how complex human systems become, they are still part of a much larger one. Architecture in these cities often reflects this philosophy. Buildings incorporate natural materials and forms. Walls might curve rather than stand straight. Windows might be placed to frame views of the surrounding land. Gardens and green spaces are woven throughout urban areas, not just as decoration, but as functional parts of the ecosystem. In some places, rooftops are used for growing plants, creating layers of greenery that soften the line between city and landscape. These gardens provide food, help manage water runoff, and offer habitats for smaller animals and birds. Lighting in cities is designed to be gentle. Bright constant light can disorient flying creatures and disrupt natural cycles. Instead, many cities use shielded lamps, soft glows and directional lighting that illuminates human spaces without spilling too far into the surrounding land. Sound, too, is considered. Loud, continuous noise can drive animals away from the important routes or feeding grounds. Urban areas develop quiet zones and noise regulations, especially near the edges of the city. As technology advances, cities begin to incorporate more complex systems for monitoring and communication. Observation towers are equipped with instruments to track weather, animal movement, and environmental changes. Information is shared quickly through networks of messengers, signals, and eventually more advanced communication tools. This flow of information allows cities to respond more effectively to changes. A warning about an approaching herd can be sent to farmers and traders. A report of a drought in one region can lead to increased trade and support from another. Despite these advancements, the daily experience of city life still includes constant reminders of the wild world nearby. A distant rumble felt through the ground, a shadow passing over a high walkway, a sudden change in bird behaviour visible from a market square. These moments break the sense of separation between human space and animal space. They remind people that their city exists within a living landscape, not apart from it. Cultural life in these cities often celebrates this relationship. Festivals are held in open plazas where people can watch the movement of the land around them. Performances and art installations incorporate natural elements like wind, water, and light. Public buildings are often decorated with imagery of animals and landscapes, not as trophies or symbols of conquest, but as representations of shared space and shared history. Different cities develop different styles based on their surroundings. A forest city might feature buildings that blend into the canopy, with walkways that connect at multiple levels. A plain city might emphasize wide views and open spaces. A coastal city might focus on harbours, observation towers, and structures designed to withstand storms and tides. Travellers moving between these cities notice these differences immediately. Each place feels shaped by its environment in a distinct way, reflecting the long conversation between people and land. As populations grow and cities become more connected, larger networks form. Alliances, trade agreements, and shared policies develop across regions. These networks often include provisions related to the movement and protection of animals, recognizing that migration routes and ecosystems do not stop at city boundaries. This leads to the beginnings of large-scale environmental planning. Regions work together to preserve corridors, manage water systems, and respond to climate changes. These efforts are not always successful, and disagreements are common, but the idea that the world is a shared responsibility becomes more widespread. At times, this awareness is tested. Periods of drought, cold, or disease can strain resources and patience. There are moments when people are tempted to prioritize their own city at the expense of others or at the expense of the surrounding land. The outcomes of these moments shape the broader course of history. Some societies double down on cooperation, strengthening networks and shared systems. Others pull inward, focusing on local control and protection. These different approaches lead to a diverse world of cities, each with its own balance between openness and caution, growth and restraint. Through all of this, the giants remain a constant presence. They move along their ancient routes, sometimes passing close to city edges, sometimes staying far away for long periods. Their behaviour continues to influence planning, culture and belief. Children growing up in these cities learn early that their home is part of a much larger picture. School lessons might include visits to observation points where they can watch herds move across distant plains. Stories told in urban settings still reference encounters with animals and the land. Even in the most developed cities where stone, metal and crafted materials dominate the view, there are places where the wild is allowed to show itself. A green corridor running through the centre, a river flowing openly through a public space, a wide sky visible from a central plaza. These features serve as reminders that civilization here is not a wall against the natural world. It is a bridge, a meeting point. As you imagine these cities at the edge of the wild, you might notice how different they feel from the idea of a city as a place of separation. Here, the city is a place of connection, a place where human paths and ancient paths cross, where stories, goods, and knowledge move alongside migrations and seasons. The future of these cities is always tied to the future of the land around them. Growth cannot happen without attention. Progress cannot happen without adjustment. Curiosity has a way of growing once it is given room to breathe. In this world, where giants never faded into memory and instead remained part of the living present, curiosity did not stop at wondering how to avoid them or live alongside them. Over time, it leaned closer. It began to ask quieter, more detailed questions. Not just, where do they go? Or, how do they move? But, how do they work? This is where the long, careful study of scales and skin begins. At first, learning comes from what the land offers freely. A shed feather caught in a branch, a piece of rough patterned skin found near a resting place, a bone uncovered by a river after heavy rain. These objects are picked up, turned over in hands, examined in the light. People notice textures, thickness, flexibility, and weight. They notice how some materials repel water, while others soak it up. They notice how some surfaces stay cool in the sun, while others grow warm. These small observations start to stack up one on top of another, forming the beginnings of a shared body of knowledge. People begin to compare. The thick, overlapping scales of a large herbivore feel different from the lighter, more flexible skin of a smaller, faster creature. Feathers from different species vary in stiffness, shape, and warmth. Even within the same animal, the texture of skin changes from one part of the body to another. The tough surface of a foot or tail tells a different story than the softer area beneath a wing or along the neck. These differences spark practical ideas. If a scale can deflect a branch or a bite, maybe it can help protect a human arm or shoulder. If feathers trap air and stay warm even in cold wind, maybe they can be used to line clothing or shelters. If a certain kind of skin sheds water easily, maybe it can be turned into a better cover for tools or food. This is not science in the modern sense of laboratories and controlled experiments. It is science as lived experience. It is testing ideas in the flow of daily life. Someone lines a cloak with feathers and notices they stay warmer on long walks. Someone uses a piece of scaled hide as a roof covering and notices the rain runs off more easily. Someone shapes a tool handle to match the curve of a bone and finds it fits the hand better. These successes are remembered. They are shared. They become part of the collective understanding of how the world works. As communities grow larger and more connected, this kind of knowledge begins to spread farther. Traders carry not just goods, but ideas. A building method learned in a wet coastal region travels inland. A way of insulating clothing developed in cold climates reaches warmer areas, where it is adapted for different needs. Over time, people begin to observe living animals more deliberately. Not just in passing, but with focused attention. They watch how certain creatures rest in the heat of the day, positioning themselves to catch or avoid the sun. They notice how others seek shade or water. They pay attention to how animals heal from wounds, how scars form, and how different species seem more or less vulnerable to certain injuries. This leads to early ideas about health and care. If an animal cleans a wound by rubbing it against a certain plant or stone, maybe that plant or stone has useful properties. If an animal avoids a certain area when injured, maybe something about that place helps or harms. People begin to test these ideas on themselves. A leaf used by a dinosaur to soothe an irritated patch of skin is tried on a human burn or scrape. A clay found near a watering hole is applied to wounds to keep them clean. Over time, a rough form of medicine develops, built on observation and careful imitation. The study of skin and scales also leads to a deeper understanding of temperature. People notice that some animals stay active in cold weather, while others slow down or seek shelter. They observe how feathers fluff up in the cold and flatten in the heat. They feel the difference between touching a sun-warmed rock and the shaded side of the same stone. These observations feed into the design of homes and clothing. Shelters are built to trap air in layers, much like feathers do. Walls are thickened in cold regions and thinned in warm ones. Ventilation is added to let heat escape without letting rain or wind rush in. Clothing becomes more sophisticated, not just in decoration but in function. Layers are added or removed depending on the weather. Materials are chosen for breathability, warmth, or protection. People begin to think about how the human body interacts with its surroundings in the same way they think about how animals interact with theirs. As this understanding grows, so does the desire to measure and compare. People start keeping records, not just stories, but notes. How long it takes for a wound to heal under different treatments. How warm a certain kind of clothing feels in different conditions. How long different materials last before breaking down. These records are shared in learning centres, in city archives, in the homes of observers and teachers. Over time, they form a kind of early library of natural knowledge, a collection of experiences that stretches across regions and generations. The presence of living dinosaurs makes this study especially rich. Unlike in a world where these creatures exist only as bones and pictures, here they can be watched, followed, and learned from directly. Some people dedicate much of their lives to this work. They travel with herds at safe distance, recording behaviour, noting changes, and gathering materials left behind. They spend long hours near watering holes, watching how different species interact, how they share or compete for space. These observers become valued members of society. Their knowledge helps builders design stronger structures. It helps doctors develop better treatments. It helps farmers choose crops that can survive in areas frequented by large animals. The idea of classification begins to take shape. People group animals based on shared traits. Those with scales, those with feathers, those with smooth skin, those that live mostly on land, in water, or in the air. These categories are not fixed or perfect, but they provide a framework for organising knowledge. Language evolves to support this. New words are created for different textures, different types of movement, different kinds of growth. The world becomes more detailed, not just in how it is seen, but in how it is described. As tools improve, people begin to look closer than ever before. Simple magnifying lenses made from polished stone or shaped glass allow them to see patterns in skin and feathers that were previously invisible. They notice tiny structures, repeating shapes, and subtle differences between individuals. These discoveries spark new questions. Why do some feathers have barbs that lock together while others remain soft and loose? Why do some scales overlap while others form solid plates? Why does skin in some areas grow thicker over time? Answers are not always clear, but the questions themselves drive further exploration. The study of growth becomes especially important. People watch young animals and notice how their bodies change as they age. They record the order in which features appear, how colours shift, how patterns form. They compare this to human growth, noticing similarities and differences. This leads to a deeper understanding of development. The idea that life follows certain paths, certain stages, becomes more widely recognised. This understanding influences how children are raised, how education is structured, and how communities plan for the future. The science of scales and skin also feeds into the development of early technology. The idea of overlapping plates inspires new forms of armour and protective gear. The structure of feathers influences the design of lighter, more flexible materials. The way skin stretches and moves over muscle informs the creation of joints and hinges in tools and machines. Even transportation is influenced. Boats are shaped to mimic the way large aquatic creatures move through water. Sails are designed with patterns that echo the wings of flying animals, catching wind more efficiently. As cities grow more advanced, specialised centres of study appear. These are not isolated from the rest of society. They are open spaces where people can come to learn, observe, and contribute. Displays of bones, feathers, and models of animals are set up for education rather than spectacle. Students are encouraged to ask questions, to test ideas, to challenge assumptions. The presence of the giants outside the city walls keeps this learning grounded. If a theory does not match what can be seen in the real world, it is revised. This practical approach to knowledge becomes a defining feature of human culture in this world. Ideas are valued, but so is evidence. Stories are respected, but so is observation. The relationship between belief and science remains close. Many people still see the giants as symbols of deeper meaning, as part of a long-living story. At the same time, they are also studied as biological systems, as collections of parts that work together in specific ways. This balance prevents either side from becoming too rigid. Science does not strip the world of wonder. Belief does not prevent the search for understanding. Medical knowledge benefits greatly from this approach. By studying how large animals heal from injuries, people learn about infection, regeneration, and the importance of rest. They notice that certain wounds heal better when kept clean and dry. They learn that some substances slow healing while others seem to help. These insights lead to better treatments for humans. Simple antiseptics are developed from plants and minerals. Splints and supports are designed based on the structure of animal bones and joints. The idea of prevention also takes hold. If certain environments or behaviours lead to illness or injury, people adjust their habits. Clean water systems are built. Waste is managed more carefully. Shelters are designed to reduce dampness and cold. The study of skin also leads to a deeper understanding of communication. Many animals use colour, pattern, and posture to signal each other. Humans begin to pay closer attention to their own body language, to the way stance and movement convey meaning. This awareness influences social customs, art, and even politics. Public speakers use gestures more deliberately. Leaders are judged not just by their words, but by how they carry themselves. Clothing and decoration become ways of expressing identity and intention. As exploration continues, people encounter new species and new forms of life. Each discovery adds to the growing body of knowledge. Maps are updated, classifications are revised, stories are expanded. The world feels larger and more detailed with every new observation. Over long periods, this accumulation of knowledge begins to shape how humans see their place in the world. They no longer see themselves as separate from the giants or the land. They see themselves as part of the same system, subject to the same rules of growth, change, and decay. This perspective encourages a long-term view. Decisions are made with an eye toward how they will affect not just the next season, but the next generation. Land is managed with an understanding of how it supports different forms of life. Resources are used with an awareness of limits. The science of scales and skin becomes in a way the science of connection. It shows how different creatures are built differently, but also how they share common needs: water, air, food, shelter. As you imagine these early observers, sitting near a riverbank with a feather in one hand and a piece of stone in the other, comparing textures and patterns, you might notice how gentle this form of science feels. It is not about domination or control, it is about attention and respect. Learning happens through closeness rather than distance, through watching rather than isolating, through living alongside rather than standing apart. Even as tools become more advanced, even as knowledge grows more complex, this foundation remains. The giants are still there, breathing, moving, leaving their marks on the land. The world is still something to be observed, not just used. As night falls over a city or a camp, and people gather once more around low fires, conversations often drift toward what has been noticed that day. A strange pattern on a new kind of scale, an unusual behaviour seen in a herd, a change in the way a certain bird flies. These small details become the building blocks of larger understanding. They are the threads that weave together practical life, belief, and curiosity into a single ongoing story. Moving through this world has never been a simple matter of going from one place to another. Every journey, no matter how short or how familiar, carries with it an awareness that the land is already in motion. Paths are not just lines on the ground. They are agreements, temporary and flexible, between people and the larger lives that move across the same space. Travel here is less about speed and more about timing, attention, and understanding when to move and when to wait. In the earliest days, travel is cautious and close to home. People move between nearby camps, water sources, and foraging areas, following routes they know well. These paths form slowly, worn into the earth by repeated footsteps, both human and animal. A narrow trail through a forest might follow the edge of a herd corridor, close enough to benefit from the open ground, but far enough to avoid the heaviest traffic. Along rivers, footpaths wind in and out of vegetation, staying near the water but rarely right beside it. As communities grow and connect, these small paths link together, forming longer routes that stretch across valleys, plains, and mountain passes. These early roads are not paved or straight. They curve with the land, rising over ridges for better views, dipping into sheltered hollows to avoid strong winds, and skirting around places where the ground shows signs of frequent heavy movement. Travellers learn to read these signs the way others might read written maps. Deep, fresh footprints mean recent passage. Flattened grass tells a story about direction and speed. Broken branches at a certain height suggest the size of what passed through. Even the smell of the air can carry information, hinting at how close or how far something large might be. Groups rarely travel alone. A lone traveller is harder to spot but also harder to protect. Moving in small groups allows for shared awareness. One person watches the ground, another listens for distant sounds, another keeps an eye on the sky. This quiet coordination becomes a kind of moving conversation, a series of small gestures, nods, and changes in pace. Travel is often planned around the rhythms of the land. Certain seasons are better for certain routes. A mountain pass that is safe in summer might be blocked by snow in winter. A river crossing that is easy in the dry season might become dangerous when rains swell the water and draw large animals to its banks. Maps, when they appear, are not just drawings of distance and direction. They are records of behaviour. This place is busy in spring. That valley is quiet at dawn. This stretch of plain is safer when the wind blows from the west. These details are as important as knowing how far something is. As technology and organisation advance, more formal roads begin to take shape. In some regions, people lay down stone or packed earth to create smoother surfaces for carts and pack animals. These roads are still built with care. They avoid cutting through major animal corridors whenever possible. Where they must cross these routes, they often do so with raised bridges or shallow tunnels, allowing large creatures to pass without being forced into narrow, unfamiliar spaces. These crossing points become important features of the landscape. They are places of heightened awareness, where travellers slow down, watch closely, and often pause to listen before moving on. Over time, shelters, way stations, and lookout posts grow near these areas, offering rest and information. In open plains, roads are often marked rather than built. Lines of stones, posts, or distinctive plants guide travellers across wide, featureless spaces. These markers are placed in ways that can be seen from a distance, but they are also designed to move or be replaced if migration patterns shift. In forests, roads take on a different character. Here, the challenge is not distance, but visibility. Paths are kept clear of low branches and dense undergrowth, creating narrow corridors of light and sound. These clearings allow travellers to see farther ahead and be seen more easily by animals, reducing the chance of sudden, dangerous encounters. As cities grow and trade networks expand, travel becomes more frequent and more diverse. Merchants carry goods across long distances. Messengers move between regions with news and warnings. Observers and scholars travel to study different animals and environments. This increased movement leads to the development of more sophisticated travel systems. Caravans form, groups of travellers who move together for safety and efficiency. These caravans often include people with different roles. Some focus on navigation, some on observation, some on communication. Caravans develop their own custom and signals. Certain sounds or gestures indicate when to stop, when to spread out, and when to move quickly. These shared languages allow large groups to move quietly and smoothly through complex terrain. The sky, too, becomes a route of exploration. Early on, humans learn to watch flying creatures for clues about weather and land. Over time, this watching turns into something more ambitious. The idea of rising above the ground, of seeing the world from a higher perspective, begins to take shape. The first attempts are simple: elevated platforms built on hills or tall trees, then towers in cities. From these vantage points, people can see herds moving across distant plains, storms forming on the horizon, and the winding lines of rivers and roads. Eventually, people begin to experiment with ways to lift themselves into the air, even if only briefly. Kites, gliders, and later, more advanced flying devices are developed, inspired by the wings and flight patterns of the creatures above them. These early flights are short and careful. They are more about observation than travel. Someone rises into the air to scout a route, to look for obstacles or danger ahead. Information gathered from above becomes a valuable resource, shared with travellers and city planners alike. As technology improves, aerial travel becomes more practical. Air routes develop, especially between major cities and across difficult terrain like mountains or wide rivers. These routes are planned with the same care as ground roads, avoiding areas where large flying creatures gather or where strong, unpredictable winds are common. The presence of flying dinosaurs and other large aerial animals adds another layer of complexity. Human pilots and navigators learn to recognize their patterns, to understand where they feed, nest, and migrate. Airspace becomes, like land and water, a shared environment. Rules and customs develop around this shared space. Certain altitudes are avoided during specific seasons. Certain routes are closed when large migrations occur. Signals are used to announce human presence in the sky, much like the visual and sound markers used on the ground. Water travel follows a similar path of cautious innovation. Rivers and coastlines are natural highways, but they are also home to large and powerful creatures. Boats are designed to be stable, quiet, and visible. Bright markings, reflective surfaces, and sound signals are used to make vessels easier to notice from a distance. Ports and harbours are built in sheltered areas, away from the main paths used by large marine animals. Breakwaters and barriers guide both water flow and animal movement, creating safer spaces for docking and loading. Travellers on water learn to read the surface of the sea and river in the same way land travellers read tracks. A sudden change in wave pattern can signal movement below. A shift in bird behaviour can indicate the presence of fish or something larger. As exploration pushes farther, people begin to venture into regions that are less familiar. New islands, distant coasts, and remote valleys draw the curious and the ambitious. These journeys are often long and risky, and they require careful preparation. Travellers carry not just food and tools, but knowledge, maps, notes, and stories from those who have gone before. They also carry the understanding that these records may need to be changed. The land is not fixed. Routes that were safe one year may be dangerous the next. This awareness leads to a culture of updating and sharing information. Way stations and cities keep records of recent travel conditions. Travellers are encouraged to report what they have seen, whether it is a new herd route, a blocked pass, or an unusual animal behaviour. These reports are taken seriously. They shape decisions made by traders, builders, and leaders. A single observation can ripple outward, affecting the movement of goods, the location of new settlements, and the planning of future journeys. The idea of the explorer evolves in this world. An explorer is not just someone who goes to new places, they are someone who brings back understanding. Their value lies not in claiming land, but in expanding the shared picture of how the world works. Some explorers focus on the behaviour of animals in distant regions, others on the shape of the land and the flow of water, others on the cultures and cities they encounter along the way. These different perspectives come together in learning centres and city archives, where maps and records are compared and combined. Over time, a more complete picture of the world begins to form, one that includes not just human spaces, but the paths and patterns of the giants as well. As travel becomes more common, so do encounters between different cultures. People from forest regions meet those from plains and coasts. They exchange goods, stories, and ways of seeing the world. These meetings are not always smooth. Different traditions and beliefs can clash. Different approaches to sharing space with animals can lead to disagreement, but they also create opportunities for learning and adaptation. A technique for guiding herds developed in one region might be improved by someone from another. A building method designed for heavy rains might be adapted for use in dry climates. Travel becomes a way of spreading not just objects but ideas. The risks of travel remain, even as technology improves. Storms, accidents, and unexpected animal behaviour can still turn a journey into a dangerous situation. These experiences become part of the shared knowledge base, shaping future planning. Safety, in this world, is not about eliminating uncertainty. It is about managing it. It is about creating systems that can respond when things go wrong. Emergency shelters are built along major routes stocked with basic supplies. Signal systems are established to call for help. Training is provided for travellers in how to respond to different kinds of danger, from injuries to sudden encounters with large animals. These measures reflect a broader understanding that the world is not something to be conquered. It is something to be navigated. As communication technologies advance, information begins to move faster than people. Messages about changing conditions, approaching herds, or dangerous weather can be sent ahead, allowing travellers to adjust their plans before they encounter trouble. This ability to share knowledge quickly transforms travel. Journeys become more predictable, even if they are not always easier. The focus shifts from reacting to problems to anticipating them. Despite these advances, the experience of travel retains a sense of humility. Standing on a high ridge and watching a herd move across a distant plain still evokes a feeling of smallness. Flying above a forest and seeing the canopy stretch to the horizon still reminds travellers of the scale of the world. These moments shape how people think about exploration. It is not about mastering the land, it is about being allowed to move through it. As generations pass, travel becomes woven into cultural identity. Songs and stories celebrate famous journeys, not for the places reached, but for the challenges faced and the lessons learned along the way. Children grow up hearing about distant mountains, wide rivers, and cities built at the edge of deserts or seas. These stories spark curiosity and a desire to see more of the world, even as they emphasize the importance of respect and preparation. Festivals in some regions mark the departure and return of travellers. Communities gather to hear what has been discovered, what has changed, and what remains the same. In these gatherings, the presence of the giants is often a central theme. A traveller might describe a new kind of animal seen far away. Another might talk about a familiar species behaving differently in a new environment. These accounts remind everyone that the world is not static. It is always in motion, shaped by countless lives moving across it. As you imagine these roads, skies, and waterways filled with careful movement and shared awareness, you might notice how travel in this world feels less like a line drawn across a map and more like a conversation. Each step, each flight, each crossing of water is a question asked of the land. Is it safe now? Is it open here? Is it time to move or time to wait? The answers come not in words but in signs. The sound of the wind, the behaviour of birds, the pattern of tracks in the mud, the distant rumble of something large moving through the night. Travellers learn to listen to these signs the way they listen to each other. They learn that the world is always speaking, even when it seems quiet. And as they move forward, carrying goods, stories, and understanding from one place to another, they become part of the same long movement that has shaped this planet for millions of years. Change, in this world, does not arrive all at once. It drifts in slowly, carried by new tools, new ideas, and the steady growth of human communities that spread a little farther each generation. Fields extend where forests once stood. Roads reach into valleys that were once quiet. Cities rise where only wind and footsteps used to pass. And through all of it, the giants continue to move, following paths shaped long before the first human shelter or fire. The future of coexistence begins, not with a single decision or law, but with a growing realization that this shared world is becoming more crowded, not just with people, but with the marks people leave behind. Early on, this realization comes in small local ways. A herd that used to pass through a familiar valley begins to take a different route. A riverbank that once supported both animals and people becomes eroded and narrow. A nesting ground that was quiet for generations starts to see more human traffic. At first, these changes are easy to explain away. The weather was different this year. The animals must have found better food somewhere else. The river simply shifted its course. But over time, patterns begin to emerge. The changes line up with new roads, new fields, new buildings. Observers, those who have spent their lives watching the land and its inhabitants, start to speak up. They compare notes from different regions. They notice that similar things are happening far apart. Migration routes are becoming more tangled. Feeding grounds are shrinking. Some species are appearing less often, or not at all. These observations begin to filter into public conversation. Around city fires, in market squares and in council gatherings, people start to talk not just about how to live alongside the giants, but how to make sure they continue to exist at all. This is not a simple shift in thinking. For most of human history in this world, the giants have felt permanent. They have been the backdrop of every story, the presence behind every horizon. The idea that they could fade not because of a sudden sky event, but because of slow, steady pressure is unsettling. The first responses are often practical and local. A community might decide to move a field away from a well-used animal path. A city might adjust the route of a road to avoid a breeding ground. A group of travellers might choose a longer route to reduce disturbance in a sensitive area. These small actions do not come from a sense of global responsibility. They come from familiarity. People protect what they know, what they have grown up with, what feels like part of their home. As communication improves and regions become more connected, these local efforts begin to link up. Stories of successful coexistence travel along trade routes. A city that managed to redirect a herd without conflict becomes an example others want to follow. A region that set aside a large area for animal movement without harming its own economy becomes a point of reference. Over time, these examples start to shape broader ideas about protection and planning. The concept of a shared future begins to take hold. It is not a formal term at first. It is more of a feeling that shows up in how people talk about the land and its inhabitants. The idea that the world people are building will be inherited not just by their children, but by the giants as well. This perspective changes how some societies approach growth. Instead of expanding outward in every direction, they begin to think about building upward, inward, or more densely. Cities redesign themselves to leave large, continuous stretches of land untouched, allowing animals to move and live without constant interruption. These areas are not always called reserves or sanctuaries in the modern sense. They are often referred to in simpler terms: the long paths, the quiet lands, the open ways. Maps begin to include these spaces as clearly as they include cities and roads. They are marked not as empty, but as important. Places where building is limited. Places where travel is guided rather than free. Places where human presence is lighter. In some regions, these protected areas become part of cultural identity. People take pride in being known as caretakers of a particular valley, forest, or stretch of plain. Festivals celebrate not just human achievements, but the continued presence of certain animals. The arrival of a herd in a protected area becomes a shared moment of recognition and respect. Science and observation play a growing role in shaping these efforts. With better tools for tracking and recording, people begin to build more detailed pictures of animal behaviour. They learn how far certain species travel, where they rest, where they raise their young, which areas are most critical to their survival. This information is shared widely. Learning centres, city archives, and public spaces display maps and records that show the movement of the giants across regions and seasons. These displays are not just educational, they are reminders, visual ways of showing how much of the world is shaped by lives other than human ones. As this knowledge spreads, so does the idea that protecting the giants also protects the systems humans depend on. Healthy herds maintain open landscapes. Rivers used by animals stay cleaner. Forests shaped by large herbivores remain more diverse. This connection between animal well-being and human well-being becomes a powerful argument for conservation, even if that word is not always used. People begin to see that caring for the giants is, in many ways, a form of caring for themselves. Of course, not everyone agrees on how far this responsibility should go. In some regions, resources are scarce. Growing populations put pressure on land and water. People who struggle to feed their families sometimes see protected areas as unfair limits. Why should land be set aside for animals when people need it to survive? These tensions lead to debates, negotiations, and sometimes conflict. Councils and leaders are forced to balance immediate human needs with longer-term goals. Compromises are made. Some protected areas are adjusted. Some development projects are delayed or redesigned. These processes are rarely smooth. They involve disagreement, frustration, and at times deep divisions. But they also involve conversation. The future of coexistence is not decided by a single group or authority. It is shaped by many voices, often in slow, uneven ways. In some places, new forms of cooperation emerge. Communities near protected areas receive support from larger networks in exchange for acting as caretakers. Resources, technology, and education flow into these regions, helping people maintain their way of life while also preserving important animal spaces. This creates a kind of partnership between urban and rural areas, between centres of trade and quiet lands. Cities benefit from the stability and resources provided by healthy ecosystems. Rural communities benefit from investment and connection. Technology continues to play a role in this evolving relationship. Advanced tracking systems allow people to monitor animal movements in real time. Warning systems alert communities when herds approach populated areas, reducing the risk of dangerous encounters. Data collected over long periods reveals trends that would otherwise be invisible. Changes in migration timing, shifts in population size, alterations in feeding behaviour. These patterns help scientists and planners anticipate problems before they become crises. For example, if a major herd begins to arrive earlier each year, this might signal a change in climate or food availability. Communities can adjust planting schedules, water management, and travel routes in response. Education systems adapt to include this growing body of knowledge. Children learn not just the names of animals and plants, but the concept of systems, how rivers, forests, plains, animals, and people are connected in chains of cause and effect. Field trips to protected areas become common. Students walk along migration routes, observe animals from safe distances, and learn how different parts of the land support different forms of life. These experiences shape how young people think about their role in the world. For many, the giants become symbols of continuity. In a time of rapid change, they represent something that has endured for millions of years. Their presence is a reminder that the world does not belong to any single generation. This symbolic role influences art, literature, and public spaces. Murals in cities depict long lines of animals moving across landscapes that include both ancient forests and modern buildings. Stories and films explore the idea of a future where humans and giants continue to adapt to each other. These cultural expressions do not always present a perfect or harmonious picture. They often include moments of loss, tension, and uncertainty. But they also highlight resilience and the possibility of finding new ways to share space. As global networks grow, regions begin to coordinate their efforts more closely. Agreements are made to protect migration corridors across multiple territories. Shared standards are developed for building near sensitive areas. Information is exchanged about best practices and new challenges. These collaborations create a sense of a world that is, in some ways, working together. Not always effectively, not always without conflict, but with an awareness that certain problems cannot be solved by one place alone. Climate change, in particular, becomes a major factor in the future of coexistence. Shifts in temperature and rainfall alter habitats, food sources, and migration patterns. Some species move into new regions, others struggle to adapt. These changes test the systems people have built. Protected areas that were once in the right place might no longer align with where animals need to go. Water management plans might need to be revised. Cities might find themselves closer to animal routes than they expected. Responding to these challenges requires flexibility. Plans are updated, boundaries are adjusted, new corridors are created. The idea of protection becomes less about fixed spaces and more about moving ones, following the needs of living systems as they change. This approach requires a high level of cooperation and trust. It means accepting that not everything can be predicted or controlled. It means being willing to change course when new information emerges. Some communities embrace this mindset more readily than others. In places where people have a long history of living closely with the giants, adaptation feels like a natural extension of existing traditions. In more heavily urbanized areas, it can feel like a new and sometimes uncomfortable demand. These differences create a varied landscape of approaches to coexistence. Some regions become leaders in conservation and adaptive planning. Others struggle, caught between economic pressures and environmental concerns. Through all of this, individual experiences continue to matter. A farmer who adjusts their planting to avoid a migration route. A builder who redesigns a structure to allow animals to pass beneath. A child who grows up visiting a protected valley and watching a herd move across it year after year. These small personal actions and memories add up. They shape how people think about what is normal, what is acceptable, and what is worth protecting. The future of coexistence is not written in a single document or policy. It is written in countless daily choices made by people who may not think of themselves as part of a grand plan, but who are, in their own way, shaping the path forward. As time goes on, new questions begin to emerge, not just about how to protect the giants, but about how to define progress itself. Is progress measured by how much land is developed, how many buildings are built, how much trade flows between cities? Or is it measured by how well different forms of life continue to thrive? These questions do not have simple answers. Different societies answer them in different ways, based on their values, experiences, and circumstances. Some prioritize growth and innovation, trusting that technology will solve the problems that arise. Others prioritize stability and preservation, moving more cautiously and slowly. Most find themselves somewhere in between, adjusting as they go. As the world continues to change, the presence of the giants remains a constant reference point. Their long lives and ancient lineages offer a sense of scale that puts human timeframes into perspective. A project planned to last a decade feels small when compared to a migration route that has existed for thousands of years. A building meant to stand for a century feels temporary when set against a species that has survived ice ages and shifting continents. This perspective influences how some people think about legacy. What does it mean to leave something behind? Is it a structure, a law, a story, or a living landscape that continues to support many forms of life? In some cultures, the idea of stewardship becomes central. People see themselves as caretakers for a world they did not create and will not fully control. Their role is to pass it on, in as healthy a state as possible, to those who come next. This idea is taught in schools, reflected in public art, and reinforced in community gatherings. It becomes part of how people talk about their responsibilities, not just to each other, but to the land and its inhabitants. As you imagine this future, you might notice how it feels both hopeful and uncertain. There are systems in place. There is knowledge and cooperation. But there is also constant change, constant need for adjustment. The world does not settle into a final, stable balance. It remains dynamic, shaped by climate, movement, and the choices of countless individuals. And through it all, the giants continue to walk, fly, and swim across the planet, leaving their marks on the land and in the stories people tell. Somewhere, in a protected valley or along a wide open plain, a herd moves slowly at dusk. A group of people stands at a distance watching, not as spectators behind a barrier, but as neighbours sharing the same evening light. The future, in that moment, does not feel like a grand plan or a distant goal. It feels like a simple, ongoing act of paying attention. Understanding yourself in a world like this does not come from looking inward alone. It comes from standing still long enough to notice what moves around you. It comes from feeling the ground change under your feet as something large passes nearby. It comes from hearing a distant call in the air and realizing that your own breath is part of the same moving space. Survival, curiosity, and wonder are not separate ideas here. They are woven together, shaping how people think, act, and imagine who they are. Survival, first, is not just about staying alive. It is about staying aware. In a landscape shared with creatures that can reshape the ground simply by walking across it, attention becomes a daily practice. People learn to listen before they speak. They learn to look before they move. They learn to pause, not as a sign of hesitation, but as a way of gathering information. This habit begins early in life. Children are taught to notice the smallest details, the way leaves shift when there is no wind, the way birds suddenly grow quiet, the way the air feels heavier before a storm or a migration. These skills are not taught through formal lessons alone. They are absorbed through experience, a walk with an older relative, a quiet moment by a river, a long wait in tall grass while something passes nearby. Over time, these moments build a kind of awareness that feels less like a skill and more like a way of being. This awareness shapes how people define strength. Strength is not just physical power or the ability to build large structures. It is the ability to read a situation and respond in a way that keeps both you and others safe. It is knowing when to move forward and when to step back. It is understanding that sometimes the strongest choice is to wait. Communities built on this idea of survival tend to value cooperation over competition. In a world where no single person can fully control what happens around them, working together becomes a practical necessity. Shared watch points, shared resources, shared knowledge. These are not abstract ideals. They are part of daily life. If someone notices a change in the land, they tell others. If someone learns a new way to build a shelter that stands up better to wind or passing animals, that knowledge spreads. Survival here is collective. It depends on connections between people as much as it depends on individual skill. This sense of shared effort often carries over into how people think about success. Success is not measured only by personal achievement. It is measured by how well a group adapts, how smoothly it moves through challenges, and how little harm it causes in the process. Curiosity grows naturally out of this way of living. When your survival depends on understanding the world around you, questions become tools. Why does this animal move at this time of day? Why does this plant grow only near this kind of water? Why does the wind change direction in this valley? These questions are not asked in a classroom or a laboratory at first. They are asked while walking, working, resting, and watching. They are part of conversation, part of storytelling, part of quiet moments of observation. Over time, this curiosity becomes more structured. People begin to keep records, compare notes, and test ideas. They notice patterns that repeat across seasons and regions. They start to see connections between things that once seemed unrelated. This habit of questioning shapes how people approach problems. Instead of jumping to the first solution, They look for underlying causes. If a herd changes its route, they ask what might have changed in the land. If a crop fails, they look at weather patterns, soil conditions, and animal behaviour. This approach leads to a kind of humility. The world is complex. Simple answers are rare. Most situations involve many factors working together. Accepting this complexity becomes part of how people think about themselves and their place in the larger system. Curiosity also shapes how people relate to each other. Different communities, shaped by different landscapes and animals, develop different ways of living. When these groups meet, curiosity can either build bridges or deepen divides. In this world, where survival often depends on sharing information, there is a strong incentive to listen. A traveller from a distant region might carry knowledge about a new migration pattern or a changing climate. A trader might bring news about a new building technique or a new way to store food. These exchanges expand people's understanding of the world beyond their immediate surroundings. They begin to see that their way of living is one of many, shaped by particular conditions rather than universal rules. This realization can be both unsettling and enriching. It challenges assumptions. It opens up possibilities. It encourages people to adapt and experiment. Wonder grows in the space between what is known and what remains mysterious. Even with careful observation and growing knowledge, much about the giants and the world they move through remains beyond full understanding. There are behaviours that do not fit established patterns. Changes in climate that arrive without clear explanation. Creatures that appear in one region and then vanish for generations. These moments remind people that not everything can be predicted or controlled. Instead of seeing this as a failure, many cultures in this world come to see it as a source of meaning. Wonder becomes a way of acknowledging limits. It is the feeling that arises when you stand on a high ridge and watch a herd stretch across the horizon, knowing that no matter how much you learn, there will always be more to see, more to ask, more to experience. This sense of wonder influences art, stories, and daily conversation. People talk about moments that surprised them, the sudden appearance of a rare animal, a storm that changed direction at the last minute, a place that felt different for reasons they could not explain. These stories are not always about big events. Often they focus on small, quiet moments. A reflection in water, a pattern in the clouds, a sound carried on the wind at dusk. These details become reminders that the world is not just a system to be understood, but a presence to be experienced. The combination of survival, curiosity, and wonder shapes how people think about progress. In many societies, progress is often defined as moving faster, building bigger, and controlling more. In this world, those ideas are tempered by constant reminders of scale. No matter how tall a building is, it is small compared to a creature that can cross a valley in a few hours. No matter how advanced a tool is, it is still limited by the complexity of the systems it interacts with. This does not lead to a rejection of innovation. People still build, invent, and improve. But there is often a parallel conversation about impact. What does this new structure mean for the land around it? How will this road affect the movement of animals? What will this technology change in daily life, not just for humans, but for the wider environment? These questions are not always answered perfectly. Mistakes are made. Some developments cause harm that is only recognized later. But the habit of asking remains, shaping how future decisions are approached. Education reflects this mindset. Learning is not just about acquiring information. It's about developing ways of seeing and thinking. Students are encouraged to observe directly, to test ideas in the real world, and to reflect on their experiences. They learn that knowledge is not something handed down fully formed, but something built over time through many contributions. This approach often produces people who are comfortable with uncertainty. They're used to working with incomplete information. They're practiced in adjusting their plans when conditions change. This flexibility becomes a valuable trait, not just in dealing with the giants, but in dealing with social and political challenges as well. Negotiations, alliances, and conflicts all benefit from the ability to see multiple perspectives and adapt to new developments. The presence of the giants also shapes how people think about time. In a world where some creatures live for decades or even centuries, human lifespans feel both significant and small. Significant because each person has a chance to learn, contribute, and leave a mark. Small because the larger story continues long after any individual is gone. This perspective encourages long-term thinking. Projects are planned with the understanding that those who begin them may not be the ones who see them completed. Stories are told with the idea that they will be heard by people who live in a different version of the world. This sense of continuity influences how people think about legacy. Instead of focusing only on personal achievements, many cultures emphasize the idea of passing on healthy systems, a well-managed valley, a preserved migration route, a body of shared knowledge. These are seen as achievements that outlast buildings and monuments. Survival, curiosity, and wonder also shape how people think about relationships. Living in close proximity to powerful, unpredictable creatures creates a strong sense of interdependence. People rely on each other for information, support, and protection. This reliance often leads to social structures that value communication and shared responsibility. Conflicts still occur, of course. Disagreements over resources, territory, and beliefs are part of any complex society. But the constant presence of larger external challenges often encourages cooperation, even between groups that do not always agree. The idea that everyone is, in some way, facing the same world becomes a unifying theme. Different cultures may have different stories and symbols, but they all respond to the same movements of land, sky, and water. This shared context creates opportunities for empathy. When a distant region experiences a drought or a major change in animal behavior, others understand the seriousness of the situation, even if they are not directly affected. They know what it means to have the rhythms of the world shift under your feet. Art and expression often reflect this sense of connection. Music might mimic the slow, steady pace of a herd or the sudden burst of movement of a predator. Visual art might combine human and animal forms, not to suggest they are the same, but to show how closely their lives are intertwined. Public spaces often include elements that invite reflection. A sculpture placed where a migration route can be seen in the distance. A wall carved with patterns inspired by scales, feathers, and footprints. These features are not just decorative. They are prompts, reminders to look beyond the immediate and consider the broader picture. Even daily routines carry traces of this mindset. A pause before starting a journey, a moment of quiet at the beginning of a meeting to share recent observations, a tradition of telling stories at the end of the day about what was noticed or learned. These small practices reinforce the idea that paying attention is a form of respect, not just for the giants, but for each other and for the world itself. As societies become more complex, there is always a risk of losing this sense of connection. Technology can create distance. Urban life can reduce direct contact with the land. Information can become abstract rather than experiential. Many cultures in this world respond to this risk by deliberately maintaining spaces and practices that keep people grounded. Urban gardens, protected natural areas within cities, regular trips outside built environments for students and workers. These efforts are not about rejecting progress. They're about balancing it with experience, about making sure that knowledge remains connected to the world it describes. The giants continue to play a role in this balance. Their presence is a constant reminder that the world is not fully shaped by human hands. There are forces, lives, and histories that exist alongside human systems, sometimes intersecting with them, sometimes moving independently. This realization can be humbling, but it can also be freeing. It suggests that not everything needs to be managed or optimized. Some things can simply be allowed to exist. This attitude influences how people think about success and failure. A failed project is not always seen as a personal flaw. It is often seen as a lesson about how the world responds to certain actions. This perspective encourages experimentation as long as it is accompanied by attention and willingness to adapt. As you imagine living in this world, you might notice how your own sense of self begins to shift. Instead of seeing yourself as a separate observer of nature, you might start to feel like one participant among many. Your footsteps become part of the patterns on the ground. Your breath becomes part of the air moving through the valley. Your choices become part of the long chain of cause and effect that shapes what happens next. This perspective does not erase individuality. People still have personal goals, dreams and struggles, but it places those experiences within a wider context. Joy becomes not just a private feeling, but something shared, a successful harvest, a safe passage through a dangerous area. The return of a herd after a long absence. Loss too is shared, a storm that damages a settlement, an animal population that declines, a familiar path that becomes unsafe. These experiences create a sense of collective memory. Communities remember not just their own history, but the history of their relationship with the land and its inhabitants. This memory shapes identity. People see themselves as part of a story that includes mountains, rivers, forests, and creatures that have existed long before, and will likely exist long after. As time passes, this way of thinking becomes woven into language, customs, and institutions. It becomes normal to talk about decisions in terms of their impact on future generations and on the wider world. This does not make life simpler. It often makes it more complicated. There are more factors to consider, more perspectives to balance, more uncertainty to accept. But it also makes life richer. There is a deeper sense of connection, a stronger awareness of belonging. As the day ends in this imagined world and light fades from the sky, people often take a moment to look outward rather than inward. They watch the horizon. They listen for distant movement. They notice how the air cools and how shadows stretch. In these moments, survival, curiosity, and wonder come together. Survival is the awareness that keeps you alert and responsive. Curiosity is the desire to understand what you see and hear. Wonder is the feeling that arises when you realize that even with all your understanding, the world remains larger, deeper, and more complex than any single mind can fully grasp. These three shape how people live, learn, and imagine their future. As the day draws itself to a close in this imagined world, there is no sharp line between what was and what will be. Light fades gradually, softening the edges of everything it touches. The sky does not suddenly turn dark. It deepens, layer by layer, like a slow breath being let out after a long stretch of activity. This is the hour when movement becomes quieter, when even the largest forms on the land seem to settle into slower rhythms. People notice this shift without needing to name it. It shows in the way voices lower. It shows in the way steps become more measured. It shows in the way eyes lift toward the horizon one last time before turning inward toward home, camp, or the familiar circle of light waiting ahead. Fires begin to glow in windows, doorways, and open spaces. Not bright flames meant to push back the night, but steady points of warmth and visibility. These small lights do not try to compete with the vastness around them. They simply exist within it, offering a place to gather, a place to rest, a place to feel grounded after a day shaped by movement, attention, and quiet choices. In the distance, something large moves. It might be a herd shifting its position for the night, bodies forming a loose protective circle. It might be a solitary creature walking along a path it has followed for years, guided by memory rather than sight. It might be wings beating slowly above the darkening land, seeking a high place to settle until morning. The sound of this movement does not always reach human ears, but the feeling often does. A subtle vibration through the ground, a change in the air, a sense that the world beyond the nearest shelter is still active, still alive, still carrying on with its own purposes. This awareness becomes part of what it means to rest. Sleep in this world is not an escape from reality. It is a continuation of it, just in a different form. The mind drifts, but the body remains part of the same landscape. breathing in air that has passed over rivers, forests, plains and scales, breathing out warmth into spaces shaped by hands and habits that stretch back through generations. People settle into their shelters, their homes, their shared spaces. Some lie beneath roofs made of layered materials that echo the textures of the land outside. Others rest under open skies, wrapped in fabrics and hides that carry the patterns and colours of the world around them. Conversations fade into murmurs. The last stories of the day are told, not with the energy of teaching or warning, but with the softness of sharing. A memory from childhood, an observation made earlier that afternoon. A small moment of surprise that does not need explanation. These stories do not always have endings. They trail off, replaced by the sounds of breathing, of shifting positions, of a fire settling into glowing embers. As eyes close, the mind often returns to the day's movements. A river crossed, a path followed, a distant shape seen against the sky. These images blend with older memories and imagined futures, creating a quiet flow of thought that mirrors the slow, steady flow of the world itself. In this half-awake, half-asleep state, the presence of the giants feels less like something external and more like something woven into the background of everything. They are part of the same fabric as the stars overhead, the wind moving through leaves, the warmth of a nearby fire. The idea that this world never lost its ancient heart is not something people usually say out loud. It is something they feel. They feel it in the way the land holds onto old paths even as new ones are made. They feel it in the way animals return to the same places year after year, guided by instincts that reach back farther than any written history. They feel it in the way their own customs, stories and habits carry traces of earlier times, earlier challenges, earlier ways of understanding what it means to be here. As sleep deepens, the boundaries between now and long ago soften. Dreams might place a person in a familiar valley, but with no sign of a city or road, or they might place them in a future landscape where new structures rise beside old migration routes. In these dreams, humans and giants often move through the same spaces without clear separation. A person might walk alongside a massive form without fear. A child might climb onto a high vantage point and see both ancient and modern features spread out below. These images are not predictions. They're reflections of a relationship, of a long shared story that continues to unfold. The night itself feels like a kind of shelter. The darkness wraps around the land, softening sharp outlines, quieting distant activity. The sky, now filled with stars, offers a sense of depth that goes beyond any single horizon. People who look up at this sky often feel a familiar mix of feelings. Smallness in the face of so much space. Belonging in the sense that they are part of this space, not separate from it. The stars do not care about who watches them. The giants do not care about the stories told about them. The land does not change its course based on human plans alone, and yet humans continue to watch, tell, build, and plan, finding meaning in the act of paying attention. This balance between what can be shaped and what cannot becomes one of the quiet lessons of this world. You can guide a path, but you cannot control the weather. You can build a shelter, but you cannot stop the seasons from turning. You can protect a valley, but you cannot guarantee that it will remain the same forever. Instead of seeing this as a limitation, many come to see it as an invitation to stay present, to keep learning, to keep adjusting. As the night moves on, the land does not become still. It simply changes its kind of activity. Nocturnal creatures emerge. The air cools, sounds carry differently. A call from far away feels closer in the quiet. Some people wake briefly in the night, not from fear but from habit. They listen. They feel the air. They check the fire or the door or the edge of their shelter. Then they settle back down, reassured by the familiar rhythms around them. These small, repeated actions carried out night after night, year after year, become part of what it means to live here. They are not dramatic. They are not celebrated. They are simply done. In this world, there is a deep understanding that life is made up of these quiet moments as much as it is made up of big events. A child falling asleep to the sound of wind in the trees. A traveller resting near a road that curves away into darkness. A city dweller lying in a high room, listening to distant sounds of movement beyond the last row of lights. Each of these people experiences the same night, but in slightly different ways. The same sky, the same air, the same shared world. As time passes, generations layer over each other. New buildings rise, old paths fade, stories change, languages shift. But the presence of the giants remains a constant thread, running through all of it. They are there in old carvings and new designs, in ancient stories and modern studies, in the way people plan their days and their futures. This continuity offers a kind of comfort. In a world that changes in countless small ways every day, there is something steady in knowing that some forms of life carry on across centuries, adapting, moving, enduring. This does not mean that everything stays the same. It means that change happens within a larger frame, one that holds both loss and renewal. People come to understand that their own lives are brief chapters in a much longer story. This realization does not make those lives feel less important. It often makes them feel more meaningful. If your time is limited, how you use it matters. How you treat others matters. How you treat the land matters. These ideas do not always show up as formal beliefs or rules. They show up in choices, in whether a path is widened or left narrow, in whether a field is expanded or a corridor is preserved, in whether a story is told in a way that encourages fear or understanding. As the night deepens and sleep becomes more complete, the mind drifts away from these thoughts, but the patterns they describe remain. Somewhere, a herd shifts its position, settling more comfortably against the cool ground. Somewhere, a flying creature tucks its wings and rests. Somewhere, water continues to move through a river, shaping its banks grain by grain. Somewhere a human breathes in and out, steady and slow. These movements are different in scale, different in speed, different in impact, but they all happen within the same shared space. The idea of an ancient heart is not about a single place or a single creature. It is about this shared rhythm, this ongoing exchange between land, life, and attention. In this world, the past is not locked away in museums or books alone. It is visible in the way a trail curves around a hill following a route that has been used for thousands of years. It is visible in the way a city leaves open spaces where herds still pass. It is visible in the way a story told to a child includes both old lessons and new details. The future, too, is not a distant, abstract thing. It is built day by day, choice by choice, in how people decide to move, build, and relate to what surrounds them. As you imagine drifting to sleep in this world, you might notice how the feeling is less about reaching an ending and more about settling into a pause. The story does not stop when the eyes close. It continues in the movement of the land, in the quiet work of the night, in the slow turning of the sky. Tomorrow will bring new sounds, new tracks in the mud, new questions to ask, and new choices to make. For now, there is only this moment, the warmth of a nearby fire, the steady rhythm of breathing, the distant presence of something large and ancient moving through the dark. This moment does not need to be explained or resolved. It does not need a final line or a closing statement. It simply exists, held within a world that has been shaped by countless lives and will continue to be shaped long after this particular night has passed. And as sleep settles in, carrying the mind away from the details of the day and into the quieter spaces of thought and dream, the shared journey continues, not with a sense of conclusion, but with the gentle understanding that there will always be another morning, another path, another story waiting just beyond the edge of the light.